The frosted windows of Margaret Ellis's modest home reflected the muted glow of a December morning. At 78, Margaret had grown used to the quiet. She sat in her favorite armchair, its cushions worn but familiar, with a festive woolen throw draped over her knees. The room was lovingly decorated, garlands of evergreen and crimson ribbons framing the fireplace, where a crackling fire fought against the chill. The scent of pine mingled with the faint aroma of freshly baked gingerbread, though no one was there to share in her small traditions. On her lap rested a carefully wrapped gift. The paper was a cheerful red and gold plaid, tied with a satin bow she'd smoothed 3 times before deciding it was perfect. The tag read, "To Peter, with all my love, Mom." She traced the name with her fingertips, her hands trembling slightly. It had been 5 years, 5 long years, since Peter, her eldest, had stepped through the door. Margaret's heart ached as she recalled his laughter, once so hearty, filling the very room where now only silence lingered. The mantelpiece was crowded with photographs. In one frame, a young Margaret stood arm in arm with her late husband, George, his smile as steady as the man she had loved for 40 years. Next to it, another picture captured a younger Peter, his sister Anna, and the youngest, David, all laughing around a snowman in the garden. Margaret glanced at the family portrait and sighed. How had it come to this? Her children scattered, each wrapped in the busy lives they'd built far from home. The grandfather clock in the corner struck 8, its chime sharp in the stillness. Margaret rose slowly, wincing as her knees protested. She shuffled to the window, pulling aside the lace curtain. Outside, the street was quiet, blanketed in snow, the hedgerows dusted white. Christmas wreaths adorned the neighbors' doors, and a few cars sat idle in driveways. She imagined the houses filled with warmth, with children tearing into presents and families gathering around hearty breakfasts. Her own table, set with her best china, sat empty. The once bustling Christmas mornings of her youth seemed like stories from another life. She pressed her hand against the cold glass and allowed herself a moment of longing. Perhaps, she thought, this year would be different. Perhaps one of them might surprise her, might remember the way she'd made every Christmas magical when they were children. But her phone had been silent. No messages beyond the obligatory greetings, polite, distant, transactional. Peter had sent her a brisk "Merry Christmas, Mom" via text the day before, a stark contrast to the hours they used to spend discussing his dreams over hot cocoa. Anna had called, but the conversation had been hurried, the clatter of her busy household echoing in the background. And David, her baby, had sent a card late, as he often did, signed with a perfunctory "Love, Dave." Margaret shook her head, trying to banish the bitterness creeping into her thoughts. "They have their own lives," she murmured aloud, her voice cracking slightly. Still, she could not deny the pang of loneliness that settled deeper each year. She turned back to the armchair and picked up the gift. The weight of it was more emotional than physical, a symbol of the connection she desperately hoped to rekindle. With deliberate care, she placed it beneath the small tree by the hearth. Its branches were adorned with ornaments she'd collected over the decades, each carrying a memory. A ceramic angel Peter had painted as a boy, a glittery star Anna had insisted was perfect despite its uneven edges, and a train-set ornament David had begged for as a child, his eyes lighting up when she'd hung it on the tree. Margaret sank back into her chair and pulled the throw tighter around her. She tried to focus on the fire, its gentle crackle a small comfort. Yet her thoughts wandered, tugged inexorably toward her children and the gulf that now seemed so vast. Where had she gone wrong? She'd given them everything, a loving home, guidance, and encouragement. She'd stayed up late sewing costumes for their school plays, cheered the loudest at their games, and listened patiently to their woes. "Maybe I wasn't enough," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The words hung in the air, unanswered. A knock at the door startled her. For a fleeting moment, hope flared in her chest. She rose quickly, her hands smoothing her cardigan as she shuffled to the entrance. She opened the door, her heart sinking as she was greeted not by one of her children but by her neighbor, Dorothy. "Merry Christmas, Margaret," Dorothy said brightly, holding out a small tin of homemade fudge. "Thought you might enjoy this." "Thank you, Dorothy," Margaret replied, mustering a smile. "How thoughtful of you." Dorothy lingered for a moment, her cheerful demeanor faltering as she glanced past Margaret into the empty living room. "Are the kids coming by today?" Margaret hesitated, then shook her head. "No, they're all quite busy this year," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Dorothy reached out, squeezing Margaret's hand warmly. "Well, if you need anything, you know where I am." As the door closed behind her neighbor, Margaret stood in the entryway, clutching the tin of fudge. The emptiness of the house seemed to press in closer. She returned to her chair, setting the tin beside her and staring at the fire. Hours passed, the gift under the tree remaining untouched. Margaret's hope dimmed with the waning light of the day, yet deep within her a spark of resilience glimmered. Tomorrow was still unwritten. As the fire burned lower in the hearth, Margaret Ellis sat still, her gaze fixed on the faint flicker of the flames. Yet her mind traveled far from the quiet room. Her thoughts drifted back to days that seemed, now, to belong to someone else's life, a life filled with voices, movement, and laughter. Christmas had once been a grand affair in the Ellis household, a time of unbridled joy, bustling preparation, and family traditions that bound them together. But those days had faded piece by piece, like an old photograph left too long in the sun. Margaret's fingers toyed absent-mindedly with the edge of her cardigan as the memories came unbidden. There had been a time when Peter, Anna, and David couldn't wait for the holidays. She could still hear their voices, ringing out in excited anticipation. She would rise early, often before dawn, to prepare the turkey or bake the sugar cookies they loved to decorate with icing and sprinkles. George, her late husband, had been her partner in these endeavors, always ready with a joke to keep the children laughing while Margaret busied herself in the kitchen. "George," she whispered, her voice soft and wistful. She looked at his photograph on the mantelpiece. His eyes, crinkled at the corners from years of laughter, seemed to twinkle back at her, though the photo was nearly 2 decades old. He had been the anchor of their family, the one who insisted on keeping traditions alive. It was George who taught the children how to string popcorn garlands for the tree and made sure they wrote letters to Santa. His absence left a gap in the fabric of their lives that Margaret had tried valiantly to mend, though some wounds, she knew, could never truly heal. Her thoughts turned to Peter, her firstborn. As a boy, he had been her shadow, always eager to help, always quick with a question. He had been the one to carry the star to the top of the tree every year, his face glowing with pride as George lifted him high. Margaret had cherished those moments, never imagining they would grow so rare. When Peter moved to London to pursue his career in finance, she had been proud, though her heart had ached to see him go. He had promised to visit often, to call, to stay connected, and for a time he had. But then the calls grew less frequent, the visits fewer. Work, he said, kept him busy. And Margaret, not wanting to seem overbearing, had swallowed her disappointment and assured him she understood. "Life moves on," she murmured, though the words felt hollow. Anna, her only daughter, had been the lively one, the spark in their family, always humming a tune or sketching in her notebook. Margaret had nurtured Anna's creativity, encouraging her to follow her dreams, and Anna had flourished, becoming an artist whose work was now displayed in galleries. But success had come with its own demands. Anna had married young and moved to New York, where her studio consumed her time. When Margaret called, the conversations were polite but rushed. There were always deadlines, always events. "We'll visit soon, Mom," Anna would say, but soon had become a word that stretched endlessly into the future. David, her youngest, had been the baby of the family in every sense. His easy smile and mischievous antics had brought laughter into their home, even in the toughest times. But David had struggled to find his footing in the world, bouncing from one job to another, moving from one city to the next. He had always been the one who seemed most in need of her guidance, yet he had grown distant in a way Margaret couldn't fully understand. His phone calls were brief, his words guarded. And though she sent him letters and care packages, she rarely heard more than a terse, "Thanks, Mom," in response. Margaret's hand rested on the gift she had prepared for Peter, the last of the presents she had once lavished on her children. Every Christmas, she had wrapped gifts with care, selecting items she thought they would love, hoping to bring a piece of her heart into their busy lives. But each year, fewer of those gifts had been unwrapped in her presence. Some remained unopened, returned to her by indifferent postal workers when her children forgot to pick them up. A deep sigh escaped her as she rose from the chair, her movements slow and deliberate. She crossed the room to the bookshelf and pulled down an old photo album. The cover was worn, the edges frayed, but it held treasures, snapshots of a time when the house had been filled with the chaos of 3 children and the steady warmth of a husband who adored her. She opened it, her fingers lingering on a picture of the family gathered around the Christmas tree. Peter and Anna were in matching sweaters, their faces bright with excitement, while David clutched a toy truck with a grin that seemed too wide for his small face. "Where did it all go?" she asked aloud, though no answer came. She closed the album gently, her heart heavy with questions she had asked herself too many times before. Had she failed them in some way? Had she pushed too hard, expected too much, or was it simply the way of things, that children grow up, move away, and forget the hands that raised them? The clock struck 9, its chime echoing through the stillness. Margaret set the album down and returned to her chair, staring once more at the fire. The weight of solitude pressed against her chest, but she refused to let it consume her. Somewhere, in the depth of her soul, she held on to a sliver of hope, a belief that the bonds they had once shared could still be mended. Christmas was a time of miracles, after all. And though the house was silent, Margaret whispered a prayer into the quiet, her voice steady despite the tears that slipped unbidden down her cheeks. The quiet hours of Christmas Eve stretched endlessly before Margaret. The festive decorations in her modest living room, which she had once delighted in arranging, seemed now to mock the emptiness that surrounded her. The fire had dwindled to embers, and outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the quiet street in an almost oppressive stillness. Margaret reached for her phone, its screen glowing faintly in the dim light, and stared at the last call she had received. It was Anna. Just yesterday. The memory of the brief conversation lingered in Margaret's mind. "Hi, Mom," Anna had said, her tone hurried. "Just calling to wish you a Merry Christmas. I'm sorry we couldn't make it this year. Things have been so hectic." Margaret had forced cheer into her voice. "Of course, dear, I understand. I'm sure you've got your hands full with the kids." "Yes, you know how it is," Anna replied, her words clipped. There had been a pause, then Anna's voice softened. "Are you all right, Mom? You sound tired." Margaret hesitated. "I'm fine, love. Just a bit tired, that's all. It's been a quiet season." "Well, I hope you have a lovely day tomorrow," Anna said, her tone brightening again, as though trying to wrap the conversation up neatly. "We'll call, I promise." The call ended quickly after that, leaving Margaret with the same ache she felt every year, a longing not just for their presence, but for the connection they once shared. Now, as the hours crawled by, that ache became something sharper. She looked at the small pile of gifts under the tree, each one wrapped with care, meant for people who would not come. She couldn't bear to see them there anymore. With a determined motion, she rose from her chair, her joints protesting, and began to gather the gifts. One by one, she placed them in a large shopping bag, her movements slow but steady. "Enough," she murmured to herself. "I've had enough of waiting." Margaret thought of the notice she had seen on the bulletin board at the community center last week. It had been simple. Volunteers needed, brighten the holidays for elderly care home residents. She had walked past it twice, feeling a tug of curiosity, but dismissed it, thinking it wasn't for her. But now, the memory of those words burned in her mind. She stood in the middle of the living room, clutching the bag of gifts, and made a decision. If her own family could not find time to visit, perhaps there were others who would welcome her company. She could not sit idly by while the hours slipped into another year of regret and sadness. The next morning, Margaret woke early, the familiar pang of loneliness still there, but dulled by a new sense of purpose. She packed the bag of gifts into her car, a small, reliable hatchback George had insisted she buy years ago. As she drove through the snowy streets, the town seemed strangely serene. Families were likely gathered indoors, enjoying the warmth of their homes and the company of loved ones. Margaret tightened her grip on the steering wheel. The care home was on the edge of town, a brick building surrounded by snow-covered hedges. Margaret hesitated in the parking lot, the engine idling as she stared at the unassuming structure. What if they didn't want her there? What if her presence was more of a burden than a blessing? She took a deep breath, thinking of George. He would have told her to go, to stop worrying about what others might think. Inside, the warmth of the building embraced her immediately, and the hum of activity filled the air. Staff bustled about, their bright uniforms a cheerful contrast to the muted beige walls. A young woman with a welcoming smile approached Margaret. "Hello, and Merry Christmas," she said. "Are you here to visit someone?" Margaret hesitated, then replied, "Not exactly. I saw the notice about volunteers, and I thought, well, I've brought some gifts, if they might be of use." The young woman's face lit up. "Oh, that's wonderful. I'm Ella, one of the coordinators here. We can always use more hands. Let me show you around." Margaret followed Ella down the hallway, the bag of gifts heavy in her hand but lighter in her heart. Ella explained that many of the residents had no family nearby, or family who chose not to visit. "It's hard for some of them," Ella said softly. "Christmas can be lonely when you're forgotten." The words struck Margaret deeply. She nodded, unable to speak. The first room they entered was small but cozy, with a large window that overlooked the snowy grounds. A frail woman with snow-white hair sat in an armchair, knitting with hands that trembled slightly. Ella introduced them. "Margaret, this is Doris. Doris, Margaret's brought some gifts to share." Doris looked up, her face lighting with a smile that seemed to erase years from her features. "Well, isn't that kind of you?" she said in a voice that quavered, but held a warmth that felt like sunlight on Margaret's soul. Margaret spent the morning visiting residents, handing out gifts and listening to their stories. Some spoke eagerly, recounting memories of Christmases past, while others needed coaxing, their words slow but meaningful. By the time the afternoon sun dipped low, Margaret felt a weariness that was more physical than emotional, a satisfying exhaustion that came from doing something worthwhile. As she returned to her car, her heart felt lighter than it had in years. The gifts were gone, but in their place was something far more valuable, a renewed sense of purpose. Margaret realized she had spent too many Christmases waiting for things to change. Perhaps it was time to be the change herself. Margaret returned to the care home the following day, carrying a neatly packed basket of cookies she had baked that morning. The memory of the previous visit lingered with her, bringing a warmth that dulled the sharp edges of her solitude. The faint scent of cinnamon and vanilla from the cookies filled her car as she pulled into the parking lot, the snow now beginning to melt in patches under the pale winter sun. Inside, the atmosphere was as lively as it had been the day before. Staff members greeted her warmly, and Ella approached with a smile that Margaret found herself returning easily. "Margaret, how lovely to see you again," Ella said. "You've been the talk of the place." "Doris couldn't stop raving about your visit." Margaret blushed slightly, clutching the basket. "I just thought I'd stop by again. It felt nice, being here." Ella's smile widened. "I'm so glad. We could use more people like you. Let me take those cookies. They'll be perfect for our little tea gathering later. In the meantime, I have someone I'd like you to meet." Margaret followed Ella down the hallway, her steps slow but steady. They passed several residents sitting in the common area, where a television played an old black-and-white Christmas movie. A few waved, and Margaret waved back, feeling a flicker of belonging. Ella stopped at a door and knocked lightly before pushing it open. Inside, the room was tidy but sparse, with a single bed and a small table near the window. A man sat in a wheelchair by the window, his back to the door. His posture was straight, and his hands rested on the arms of the chair with a certain dignity. He turned as Ella spoke. "Henry, this is Margaret. She's been volunteering here and thought she'd come by to visit." Henry's face was weathered, his cheeks hollow but his eyes sharp, like a man who had once commanded attention and still knew how to hold it. He studied Margaret for a moment before nodding curtly. "Another do-gooder," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Well, come in if you must." Margaret hesitated, unsure if he was serious or teasing, but Ella nudged her forward with a reassuring smile. Margaret stepped inside, clutching her handbag like a shield. "I don't mean to intrude," she said gently. "I just thought I'd say hello." Henry gestured toward the chair near his bed. "You might as well sit. No sense standing there looking nervous." Margaret sat, smoothing her skirt as she did. Henry turned back to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered garden below. "I suppose they told you I'm a miserable old coot," he said after a moment. "That's what they think, anyway." Margaret chuckled softly, surprising herself. "No one said that, but you're doing a fine job of convincing me." Henry glanced at her, the corner of his mouth twitching. "You've got a bit of bite, don't you?" "I respect that." The tension eased slightly, and Margaret allowed herself to relax. She noticed a stack of books on the table beside him, their spines well worn. One title caught her eye. "You're a Hemingway fan?" she asked. Henry nodded. "Read every word he ever wrote. Man knew how to tell a story." Margaret smiled. "I always found his writing a bit too stark. I prefer something with more warmth." Henry raised an eyebrow. "And what would you suggest?" "Jane Austen, perhaps. Why not? There's more to life than wars and bullfights." The conversation continued, their words moving back and forth like a slow, steady tide. Henry told her of his years as a teacher, his passion for literature, and his fondness for gardening, which he had been forced to abandon when his health declined. Margaret shared snippets of her own life, her children, her late husband, her love of baking. She spoke carefully, revealing just enough to keep the conversation flowing, but holding back the deeper aches of her heart. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself drawn to Henry's wit, which masked a sorrow she recognized all too well. She noticed the way his hands tightened on the armrests when he spoke of his wife, long gone, or how his gaze grew distant when he mentioned the garden he'd once tended with such care. "You miss it, don't you?" Margaret asked softly. "Miss what?" Henry replied, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Having something to care for, something that feels like yours. Henry was silent for a moment, then nodded. Yes, I suppose I do. Margaret looked at him, feeling a strange kinship. They were two people adrift, searching for meaning in the spaces left by what they had lost. For the first time in years, Margaret felt a flicker of connection, a sense that she was not entirely alone in her struggles. As she rose to leave, Henry spoke again. "You'll be back, won't you?" Margaret turned, surprised by the question. She saw in his expression a vulnerability he was trying to hide, a flicker of hope he couldn't quite extinguish. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll be back." Henry nodded, and for the first time, Margaret thought she saw the hint of a smile. As she stepped out into the hallway, her heart felt lighter. She had come here to give, but she realized she was receiving something in return, a purpose, a chance to mend not just her loneliness, but perhaps someone else's as well. Margaret returned to the care home the following week with a basket of fresh muffins she had baked early that morning. Snow still blanketed the town, though it was beginning to recede, revealing patches of damp earth and frost-bitten grass. As she entered the familiar warmth of the care home, she felt a growing sense of ease, as if the once unfamiliar place had become a sanctuary of sorts, a space where her presence seemed to matter. Ella greeted her near the entrance, her cheerful demeanor undiminished despite the hectic holiday season. "Margaret, back again so soon? I'm beginning to think we should put you on the payroll." Margaret chuckled softly. "I'm not sure your budget could handle me. I thought I'd bring a little something for tea this afternoon." Ella peeked into the basket, her face lighting up. "Blueberry muffins. Oh, you'll spoil them, you know. Henry's been asking about you." Margaret's steps slowed slightly. She hadn't expected that. "Has he now?" Ella nodded, a knowing smile on her face. "He doesn't say much to most people, but he's taken a liking to you, I think." Margaret didn't reply, but a warmth spread through her chest. She had spent hours with Henry during her last visit, their conversation meandering from literature to life's uncertainties. His gruff exterior had softened just enough to reveal a man grappling with the same loneliness that often kept her awake at night. The connection, however tentative, had left a mark on her. Ella led Margaret to the small sitting room where Henry often spent his afternoons. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth a welcome reprieve from the chill outside. Henry sat in his usual spot by the window, a book open on his lap. When he looked up and saw Margaret, his expression shifted, subtle but enough for her to notice. "Well," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I see you've decided to grace us with your presence again." Margaret smiled, unbothered by his gruffness. "Someone has to make sure you're behaving yourself." Henry smirked faintly, gesturing for her to sit. She placed the basket on the table between them and took her usual seat. They spoke as they had before, their conversation weaving between humor and seriousness, each testing the waters of trust. Henry told her about his favorite gardening tools, still stored in a shed he hadn't visited in years, while Margaret shared a story about a mischievous raccoon that had once terrorized her vegetable patch. The room felt brighter with their shared laughter, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. As they talked, Margaret's eyes wandered to a small shelf near Henry's bed. A photograph in a simple wooden frame caught her attention. It showed a group of people standing arm in arm in front of a barn, their faces frozen in youthful joy. One of the men looked startlingly familiar. She leaned forward, her heart skipping a beat. "Henry, who is that man? The one on the far left?" Henry glanced at the photo, his expression unreadable. "That's Richard. He and I were thick as thieves in our younger days." "Why?" Margaret's throat tightened. She recognized the man instantly. That's Richard Walker, isn't it? Henry nodded slowly. You knew him. Margaret sat back, her mind racing. He was my late husband's best friend. George and Richard grew up together. Henry's gaze sharpened. George Ellis? That was your husband? Yes, Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The weight of the coincidence settled over her, heavy and unyielding. Henry leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he processed the revelation. Well, I'll be damned. George was a good man, stubborn as a mule, but a good man. Margaret chuckled faintly, her heart still racing. That sounds like him. The air between them shifted, charged with a new intensity. The photograph seemed to anchor them both in a shared past, a connection neither had anticipated. Margaret felt a flood of questions rise to the surface. Had Henry known George well? Had their paths crossed more often than she realized? And why had he never mentioned it before? Henry seemed to sense her unease. He reached for the photograph, holding it in his hands with a care that belied his gruff demeanor. Richard and I lost touch after he moved west. I always wondered what became of him. And George. Margaret swallowed hard, her voice trembling. George passed away nearly 20 years ago. Heart attack. Henry nodded solemnly, his gaze fixed on the photograph. I'm sorry to hear that. He deserved more time. They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling softly in the background. Margaret's mind churned with memories of George and the stories he had told her about his youth. Richard had been a frequent figure in those tales, always the adventurer, always the one who pushed boundaries. Now, sitting across from Henry, Margaret felt as though she were piecing together a puzzle she hadn't known existed. Henry, she said finally, her voice hesitant. Did you know my husband well? Henry's eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw something vulnerable in his expression. Well enough, he said simply. Well enough to know he was lucky to have you. The words lingered between them, unspoken truths hiding in their shadows. Margaret felt a strange mix of emotions, curiosity, sadness, and a growing sense of connection. She had come here searching for purpose, and yet, it seemed, the past had found her instead. The days passed quickly after Margaret's discovery of the photograph in Henry's room. She found herself visiting the care home more often, her interactions with Henry deepening into something she could not quite define. Their shared connection through George and Richard felt like a lifeline, pulling her out of the solitude she had grown so accustomed to. But it was more than that. Each time she walked through the care home's doors, she saw faces light up at her presence, and it filled a void that had grown inside her over the years. On a brisk January morning, Margaret arrived with a tray of freshly baked scones. The cold air bit at her cheeks as she hurried inside, grateful for the warmth of the familiar building. Ella greeted her near the entrance, balancing a stack of papers and wearing her ever-present smile. Margaret! You're becoming a regular, Ella said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. Margaret smiled back. It's good to feel useful again. Besides, Henry would never forgive me if I stopped bringing him his scones. Ella laughed, motioning toward the hallway. He's been asking about you, and not just him. Doris has been raving about the muffins you brought last week. I think you've become a bit of a celebrity around here. Margaret blushed slightly, though the words warmed her. It was a small thing, but knowing she had made a difference, even just by baking or listening, was enough to brighten her days. As she made her way to Henry's room, she passed by the common area. Several residents were gathered, their laughter rising above the hum of conversation. Margaret paused, drawn to the sight of their animated faces. Among them was Doris, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she spoke to a man whose name Margaret had yet to learn. Another resident, a woman with sparkling eyes named Mabel, was recounting a story about her childhood, her hands gesturing wildly. Margaret lingered for a moment, feeling a sense of community she hadn't realized she missed. It reminded her of the neighborhood gatherings she used to host with George, where laughter and conversation spilled into the night. She resolved to join them later, after her visit with Henry. When she entered Henry's room, he looked up from the book he was reading, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Ah, the scone lady returns." Margaret set the tray down on the table near his bed, giving him a mock scowl. "Is that all I am to you? A baker?" Henry chuckled, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "You're much more than that." "But I'd be lying if I said the scones weren't part of the appeal." Margaret sat in her usual chair, shaking her head in mock exasperation. Their banter had become familiar, a rhythm she found herself looking forward to. As they shared the scones and tea, the conversation turned once again to George and Richard. "Richard always had a way of making you feel like the world was full of possibilities," Henry said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "He and George, they were like brothers. I envied that." Margaret tilted her head, intrigued. "Why would you envy it? You were part of their circle, weren't you?" Henry nodded slowly. "I was. But Richard and George, they had a bond that was hard to match. They shared everything, trusted each other completely. I admired it, but it also reminded me of what I didn't have." Margaret studied him, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. She chose not to press, instead letting the silence settle between them like an old friend. In time, she had learned people revealed what they were ready to share. After leaving Henry's room, Margaret made her way back to the common area. She was welcomed warmly, Mabel patting the seat beside her with a wide grin. "Come join us, dear," Mabel said. "We were just talking about the old days." Margaret sat, feeling an unexpected sense of belonging as the conversation enveloped her. They spoke of holidays long past, of dances and dinners, and of the small joys that had sustained them through life's trials. Margaret listened as much as she spoke, marveling at the resilience woven into each story. At one point, Doris turned to her, her knitting pausing mid-stitch. "You know, Margaret, you've got a way about you. It's like you bring a bit of light wherever you go." The words caught Margaret off guard. She hadn't thought of herself as someone who brought light. If anything, she had felt like a shadow in her own life for so long. But here, among these people, she felt a stirring of something she hadn't in years: purpose. "I think I needed this as much as anyone," Margaret admitted, her voice soft but steady. Doris nodded knowingly. "That's the secret, isn't it? We're all just trying to hold each other up." The sentiment stayed with Margaret long after she left the care home that day. As she drove home, the winter sun setting behind the trees, she thought about how much had changed in just a few weeks. She had come here out of loneliness, seeking something to fill the emptiness. What she found was a community of people who, like her, had their own stories of loss and longing, but also of hope and strength. For the first time in years, Margaret felt as though she was truly living, not just waiting for life to happen. The care home had become more than a place she visited. It had become a part of her world, a place where she could give and receive in equal measure. And in the quiet moments, when she reflected on all she had gained, she realized that strength wasn't something you found on your own. It was something you built together. As the new year unfolded, Margaret found herself caught between two worlds. Her days were filled with purpose at the care home, her time spent listening to stories, sharing laughter, and slowly uncovering pieces of her own past through her conversations with Henry. Yet, as the evenings crept in and the house grew silent again, her thoughts inevitably turned to her children. It had been weeks since Anna's hurried Christmas Eve phone call, and even longer since Margaret had heard from Peter or David. The absence of her children gnawed at her, a persistent ache that no amount of activity seemed to soothe. She tried to tell herself it didn't matter, that she was building something new with the community at the care home. but the weight of unspoken words lingered. One evening, as she sat in her armchair with the phone resting on the table beside her, Margaret took a deep breath and dialed Peter's number. The line rang several times before his voicemail picked up. She hesitated, then left a brief message. "Hello, Peter, it's Mom. I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing. I hope everything is all right. Give me a call when you have a moment." She set the phone down with a sigh, staring at the fireplace. She could already picture his response. If he called back at all, it would be polite but perfunctory. The conversation steered away from anything too personal. Margaret closed her eyes, trying to shake the sense of futility. The next day, while helping Ella prepare for a tea gathering at the care home, Margaret shared her worries. She had grown comfortable confiding in Ella, whose easy warmth made her feel safe. "I don't want to sound ungrateful," Margaret said, her voice low. "Being here has been such a blessing, but I can't help thinking about my children. I thought they'd want to be part of my life, even as they grew older. But it feels like I'm the only one trying to keep us connected." Ella paused, the teacup she was holding hovering mid-air. "Have you told them how you feel?" Margaret shook her head. "What's the point? They're busy with their lives." "I don't want to be a burden." Ella set the teacup down gently and turned to Margaret, her expression thoughtful. "You're not a burden, Margaret. You're their mother. Maybe they've just lost sight of how much you mean to them. It happens, you know. People get caught up in their own lives and forget to look back." Margaret considered Ella's words, a mixture of hope and skepticism stirring within her. Before she could reply, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, surprised to see Anna's name on the screen. "Excuse me," Margaret said, stepping into the hallway to answer. "Mom." Anna's voice was slightly hesitant. "I was just thinking about you. How have you been?" Margaret felt a rush of conflicting emotions, relief, irritation, and a longing she couldn't quite name. "I'm well, Anna. I've been spending a lot of time at the care home, actually. Volunteering." "Oh," Anna said, her tone shifting to one of polite curiosity. "That's nice. What made you decide to do that?" Margaret hesitated, unsure how much to share. "It just felt right. There are so many people there who don't have anyone to visit them. It reminded me of how lonely I've been during the holidays." Anna was silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you feel that way. It's not about blame, Anna," Margaret said gently. "I just miss you, all of you. It feels like I've been waiting for years for us to have the kind of relationship we used to." Anna's sigh crackled through the line. "I miss that too, Mom, but life gets so complicated with the kids and work and everything else." Margaret closed her eyes, her grip tightening on the phone. "I understand, Anna. I do. But I hope you know I'm still here. I'll always be here." Their conversation ended soon after, leaving Margaret with a mixture of hope and frustration. She had said her piece, but whether it would lead to any real change remained uncertain. That evening, as Margaret prepared for bed, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Peter. She stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "Hi, Peter," she said, her voice cautious. "Mom," he said briskly. "Got your message. Everything's fine. Busy as always. You know how it is." Margaret bit her tongue, willing herself to stay calm. "I'm glad you're doing well. I just wanted to hear your voice. It's been a while." "Yes, well, things have been hectic," Peter replied, "but we should catch up soon. Maybe I'll find some time to visit in the spring." Spring. The word landed heavily in Margaret's chest. She forced a smile into her voice. "That would be lovely, Peter." The call ended quickly, leaving Margaret feeling as though she had reached out only to touch a wall. She sat in the quiet of her bedroom, the familiar ache settling in once more. But this time, she felt a flicker of determination beneath it. She would not let her children's distance define her life. There was a new world waiting for her at the care home, a place where she was needed, where she could build connections that didn't depend on anyone else's schedule or priorities. As she lay down to sleep, Margaret resolved to keep moving forward. The love she held for her children would always be there, but she could no longer wait for them to fill the emptiness in her life. She had found a purpose, and she would hold on to it, even as the bonds of family remained fragile and uncertain. Margaret arrived at the care home early one brisk morning, her breath visible in the frosty air as she hurried inside. She had spent the previous evening baking shortbread, and the tin she carried gave off a comforting, buttery scent. The staff were already bustling about, preparing for the day, and Margaret was greeted with warm smiles and familiar nods as she made her way toward the common area. She spotted Ella near the coffee station, pouring tea into cups arranged on a tray. Ella's cheerfulness was infectious, and Margaret couldn't help but smile. "Good morning, Margaret," Ella called out. "I hope you brought something wonderful, as always." Margaret held up the tin. "Shortbread this time. I thought it might go well with tea." "You spoil us," Ella said, her grin widening. "Why don't you join us in the common room today? Mabel's been asking after you, and Doris has taken to calling you our Margaret. You've become quite the favorite." Margaret felt a warmth spread through her at the thought. She followed Ella into the common area, where a handful of residents were already gathered. Doris waved enthusiastically, her knitting needles clicking in time with her movements, and Mabel patted the seat beside her, motioning for Margaret to join them. Margaret placed the tin on the table, its lid already being removed by eager hands, and settled into the chair. The conversations around her were lively, full of laughter, and the kind of teasing that only comes from shared trust. She found herself drawn into their stories, the hours slipping by unnoticed. As the group began to thin, Margaret noticed Henry watching from his usual seat near the window. His book lay closed on his lap, and his expression was unreadable, though his eyes followed her movements. She felt a pang of guilt for not having gone to him sooner and rose to make her way over. "Good morning, Henry," she said, sitting in the chair opposite him. "I thought I'd see how you were doing." Henry raised an eyebrow, his tone dry. "I wondered if you'd forgotten about me with all your new friends." Margaret smiled softly, recognizing the hint of vulnerability beneath his words. "I could never forget you, but they were insisting I share my shortbread, and you know how persuasive Doris can be." Henry chuckled, a low rumble that softened his features. "I suppose I'll forgive you." Just this once. Their conversation meandered, as it often did, touching on books, the changing weather, and memories of Christmases past. Yet Margaret sensed a tension in Henry that hadn't been there before, a restlessness that showed in the way his fingers tapped the arm of his chair. "Is something bothering you?" she asked gently. Henry hesitated, then shook his head. "It's nothing. Just an old man's thoughts." Margaret didn't press, though she felt a flicker of concern. She knew Henry well enough by now to recognize when he was holding something back. Instead, she shifted the conversation, telling him about a recipe she had been meaning to try. His mood seemed to lift slightly, though the shadow in his eyes remained. Later, as Margaret helped Ella tidy up after tea, Ella paused, her expression thoughtful. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" "Of course," Margaret said, wiping down a table. "How are you finding it here? I mean, really," Ella said, leaning against the counter. "You've become such a fixture, but I wonder if it's starting to feel like, well, too much." Margaret straightened, considering the question. "It's been wonderful. I feel like I'm doing something meaningful, and the people here, they've brought so much light into my life." But Ella tilted her head. "But," Margaret sighed, folding the towel in her hands. Sometimes I wonder if I'm leaning on this too much, filling a space that should belong to my family. Ella nodded slowly. I can see why you'd feel that way. But, Margaret, you're allowed to have more than one kind of family. The people here, Henry, Doris, Mabel, they care about you. And it's not because you're filling a space. It's because you've made one. Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away, offering Ella a grateful smile. Thank you. I needed to hear that. As she drove home that evening, Margaret's thoughts returned to Henry. His quiet withdrawal nagged at her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. She resolved to spend more time with him during her next visit, to see if she could coax out whatever was troubling him. At the same time, Ella's words lingered in her mind, planting a seed of doubt. Was she building something new, or was she simply masking the ache of her children's absence? Margaret couldn't be sure, but she knew one thing. She had found a purpose here, and it had given her life a sense of meaning she hadn't felt in years. Still, the question of whether she was truly healing or merely hiding remained unanswered, an echo she carried with her into the quiet of her home. Margaret arrived at the care home early on Christmas Day, the chill in the air sharp but invigorating. The sky was pale blue with wisps of clouds, and a sense of quiet filled the town as though the world itself were holding its breath in anticipation. She had spent the morning preparing small packages of treats, homemade fudge and shortbread, wrapped in cheerful paper and tied with ribbons. Each package was labeled with care, bearing the name of a resident who had become dear to her over the past weeks. The care home was bustling with activity when she entered. Staff members hurried past with trays of food and decorations, their faces alight with the joy of the season. Ella spotted Margaret immediately and came over, her cheeks flushed from the effort of organizing the day's festivities. "Margaret, you're a sight for sore eyes," Ella said, her smile broad. "We're setting up for the Christmas tea in the dining hall. I'm so glad you're here." Margaret handed Ella one of the treat packages. "This is for you, Ella. Just a little something to say thank you for everything you've done." Ella's eyes softened, and she took the package with a laugh. "You didn't have to do this, but thank you. Really, Margaret. You've been such a gift to us this year." Margaret nodded, though the words sat heavy in her chest. She couldn't shake the thought that while she was bringing joy to others, her own family's absence loomed like a shadow over the day. Still, she pushed the feeling aside and followed Ella into the dining hall. The room was alive with chatter and laughter as residents settled into their seats. A tree stood in the corner, its branches adorned with handmade ornaments and twinkling lights. Margaret helped distribute the treats. Pausing to chat with Doris, Mabel, and others, her heart lightened by their smiles and gratitude. When she reached Henry's table, he looked up from his plate with a faint smirk. "What's this, then? Another bribe to keep me in line?" Margaret placed the package in front of him and sat down. "If that's what it takes, then yes." "Merry Christmas, Henry." He opened the package with care, inspecting the contents before nodding approvingly. "Shortbread again. You do know how to spoil a man." Margaret laughed, but as the conversation turned to the day's events, her thoughts began to wander. The dining hall was filled with warmth and cheer, yet a deep ache stirred within her. She glanced at the empty chair beside her and imagined Peter sitting there, his booming laughter filling the space. She saw Anna's children running around the room, their excitement infectious. She even pictured David, his easy smile a balm for her restless heart. But the images were fleeting, dissolving into the reality of the moment. Henry seemed to notice her distraction. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his tone softer than usual. Margaret hesitated, then sighed. "I suppose I'm just feeling the weight of the day. It's lovely here, truly, But I can't help thinking about my children. I always hoped Christmas would be the time they'd come home, that we'd all be together again." Henry nodded, his expression unreadable. "Family has a way of getting under your skin. They can be half a world away, and yet they're still right here," he said, tapping his chest. Margaret smiled faintly. "I know they love me in their way. But it's hard not to feel forgotten sometimes." Henry leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "You're not forgotten, Margaret, and you're not alone either. Look around. These people, they care about you. That counts for something." She glanced around the room, taking in the smiling faces and the warmth that seemed to radiate from every corner. Henry was right. These people had become her family in ways she hadn't expected. Yet the longing for her children remained, an ache that refused to be soothed. As the afternoon wore on, the tea party drew to a close. Margaret helped clear the tables and said her goodbyes, her steps slow as she made her way toward the exit. The day had been a success in every measurable way, but as she stepped outside into the fading light, a wave of doubt washed over her. Was she truly moving forward, as she liked to believe? Or was she simply filling her days with activity to mask the emptiness that lingered beneath the surface? The thought unsettled her, and for a moment she considered turning back, seeking solace in the warmth of the care home. But she knew that no amount of tea or laughter could quiet the questions stirring in her heart. As she drove home, the streets were quiet, the windows of houses glowing with the soft light of family gatherings. Margaret's mind drifted to her own home, where the silence would be waiting for her. The thought was almost unbearable, yet she pressed on, knowing that the answers she sought wouldn't come easily or quickly. That night, as she sat by the fire with a cup of tea, Margaret allowed herself to feel the weight of her emotions. The care home had given her so much, a sense of purpose, a community, and the beginnings of a new chapter. But it had also forced her to confront the gaps in her life, the places where love and connection had once thrived and now felt hollow. For the first time in years, Margaret let the tears come, her shoulders shaking as she allowed herself to grieve, not just for what she had lost, but for what she still longed to find. The fire crackled softly, its warmth a small comfort in the stillness of the night. And as the tears subsided, Margaret found herself whispering a quiet prayer into the empty room, a plea for strength, for hope, and for the courage to keep moving forward no matter where the path might lead. The morning sun streamed through Margaret's window as she prepared for another visit to the care home. The kettle whistled softly in the kitchen, and she poured herself a cup of tea, savoring its warmth. The previous day's Christmas gathering had left her both fulfilled and weary. While the residents had filled her heart with joy, the persistent ache for her children lingered in the quiet hours afterward. She gathered her things, a scarf to guard against the lingering chill, a tin of cookies she had baked the night before, and a small book of poetry she thought Henry might enjoy. The drive to the care home was peaceful, the snow beginning to melt into slushy puddles along the roadside. The streets were quiet, the hum of holiday festivities having softened into the stillness of the days that followed. When she arrived, the care home was quieter than usual. The festive decorations still hung, though their sparkle seemed dimmer in the softer light of morning. Margaret greeted Ella, who was sorting through a pile of cards and letters on the front desk. "Good morning, Margaret," Ella said brightly. "You've come at the perfect time. I've just sorted through the mail, and there's something here for you." "For me?" Margaret asked, surprised. Ella nodded, handing her an envelope. It was slightly worn, the handwriting on the front shaky but familiar. Margaret felt a flutter of curiosity as she turned it over, noting the care home's return address. Without opening it, she slipped it into her bag, deciding to read it in a quiet moment. She spent the morning as she usually did, moving from room to room, chatting with residents and offering her time and small comforts. Doris had saved her a seat in the common area, where a group was reminiscing about their childhood winters, and Mabel insisted on teaching Margaret a card game she had recently rediscovered. The hours passed quickly, filled with warmth and companionship. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Margaret finally made her way to Henry's room. He was sitting by the window, as always, though his expression was more pensive than usual. A book lay unopened on his lap, and he seemed lost in thought. "Good afternoon, Henry," Margaret said softly, placing the tin of cookies on the table beside him. Henry looked up, his gaze softening when he saw her. "Ah, my partner in crime. Come to brighten another dreary day." "I thought I'd try," Margaret replied with a smile, taking the chair opposite him. They spoke for a while about mundane things, the weather, the dwindling decorations, and the book she had brought for him. But Margaret sensed there was something he wasn't saying. His usual sharp wit seemed dulled, his words carefully measured. "Are you all right, Henry?" she asked finally. He hesitated, then gave a small shrug. "Just thinking about the past. It has a way of creeping up on you when you least expect it." Margaret nodded, understanding all too well. "It does," she said softly. "Sometimes it feels like it's more present than the here and now." Henry looked at her for a long moment, as though deciding whether to say more, but instead he gave her a small smile and changed the subject, asking about the card game Mabel had taught her. Margaret let it go, though the weight of his words lingered in her thoughts. When she returned home that evening, the envelope Ella had given her sat on the kitchen table, waiting. Margaret poured herself a cup of tea and sat down, turning the envelope over in her hands. The handwriting, though unsteady, was familiar now that she studied it more closely. With careful fingers, she opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The paper was lined, the words written in the same trembling hand. As she began to read, her breath caught. The letter was from Henry. "Dear Margaret, there is something I feel I must tell you. It has weighed on my mind since the day we first spoke about your late husband, George. You see, Margaret, George and I crossed paths once, though I doubt he ever mentioned me. I knew him through Richard, back in the days when our friendships were simpler and life hadn't yet divided us into our separate worlds. There is something I've held on to for many years, something I never thought I would need to share. But now, seeing the kindness you've brought into my life, I realize that some truths are not meant to be carried alone. I will leave it to you to decide whether you wish to speak of this further. Just know that I am here, as you have been for me, should you need to. Yours, Henry. Margaret set the letter down, her hands trembling slightly. The words were vague, yet heavy with meaning. What was it Henry had been holding on to all these years? And why had he chosen now to tell her? Questions swirled in her mind, and she felt the weight of something just out of reach, something that could shift the way she saw her past. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, her heart racing. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the warmth of the room at odds with the chill that had settled over her. She knew she would have to speak to Henry, to uncover the truth behind his words. But for now, she sat in the quiet of her home, the unanswered questions casting long shadows into the evening. Margaret arrived at the care home the following day, with Henry's letter tucked safely in her handbag. The weight of his words lingered in her mind, stirring a mixture of curiosity and unease. She replayed the letter's cryptic lines repeatedly, trying to piece together what it could mean. The thought that Henry might hold a secret about her late husband unsettled her, and yet she felt a strange pull to uncover the truth. The care home was quieter than usual that morning, the lull after the holiday festivities giving it an almost serene atmosphere. Ella greeted Margaret at the door, her usual cheerful demeanor subdued as she managed a pile of paperwork at the reception desk. "Good morning, Margaret," Ella said, glancing up. "Henry's in his room. He's been a bit quieter than usual today. Might be glad for the company." Margaret nodded, her resolve firming. "Thank you, Ella. I'll head there now." As she made her way down the hall, Margaret's mind raced with questions. What could Henry have meant in his letter? Was it a memory, a regret, or something more significant? By the time she reached his door, her hands trembled slightly, but she steadied herself with a deep breath before knocking. "Come in," Henry's voice called, gruff but welcoming. Margaret stepped inside, finding Henry seated in his usual spot by the window. His gaze drifted over the snowy garden outside, his expression contemplative. A book lay open on his lap, though it seemed untouched. "Good morning, Henry," Margaret said, closing the door behind her. She took the chair opposite him and set her handbag on the floor. Henry turned to her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're back. Didn't scare you off with that letter, then?" Margaret hesitated, her heart beating faster. "No, Henry. But I have to admit, it's been on my mind since I read it." Henry nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the book in his hands. "I thought it might be." There was a pause, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between them. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "Henry, what is it you're trying to tell me? You said you knew George through Richard, but there's more, isn't there?" Henry sighed, setting the book aside. His shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time, Margaret saw a vulnerability in him that he had always hidden behind his wit and gruffness. "I didn't mean to dredge up the past," he began, his voice low, "but seeing you here, knowing who you are, it stirred something in me, memories I've tried to bury." Margaret leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What kind of memories, Henry?" He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "Margaret, I knew George well, perhaps better than I should have. Richard and I were close, as you know, but it was George who changed the course of my life in ways I never expected." Margaret's breath hitched. "Changed your life? How?" Henry hesitated, the words seeming to catch in his throat. "It was a long time ago. George and I, well, let's just say we didn't always see eye to eye. But there was a time, before you came into his life, when I cared for him, more than a friend should." The room seemed to tilt slightly as Margaret absorbed his words. You were in love with George." Henry nodded, his gaze steady. "I was, and he knew it. But he was never cruel about it. George was kind, in a way that I admired but also resented. He knew how to let me down gently, and for that I respected him. But when he met you, Margaret, it became clear to me that he had found his match, and so I stepped aside." Margaret stared at him, her mind reeling. She had never imagined this kind of connection between her late husband and Henry, never suspected that George's past held such complexities. And yet, as she looked at Henry, she saw not bitterness, but a quiet acceptance that spoke to years of reflection. "Why are you telling me this now?" Margaret asked softly. Henry's shoulders lifted in a faint shrug. "Because you deserve to know the truth, and because, seeing you here, the way you've brought life to this place, it reminded me of what I admired most about George. You have that same kindness, Margaret, that same light." Tears pricked at Margaret's eyes, but she blinked them away, her heart full of conflicting emotions. She thought of George, of the life they had built together, and of the pieces of him she had never fully understood. Henry's words didn't diminish her memories. Instead, they added depth to the man she had loved. revealing facets of him she had never known. "Thank you for telling me," Margaret said finally, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to fall. "It must have been difficult to carry this for so long." Henry nodded, his expression softening. "It was. But telling you, it feels like I've let go of something I've been holding on to for years." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Margaret reached out, placing a hand over Henry's. "You've given me something too," she said quietly. "A new way to remember George, and I'm grateful for that." Henry's hand tightened around hers briefly before he pulled away, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I suppose we've both carried our share of burdens. Maybe it's time we set them down." Margaret nodded, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't expected. The truth, though unexpected, had brought them closer, weaving their lives together in a way that felt both profound and healing. The days following Henry's revelation were a blur of emotions for Margaret. She carried his words with her, feeling their weight shift as she turned them over in her mind. The tenderness in his confession about George had stirred something unexpected, an ache not only for the man she had loved, but also for the parts of him she had never known. Yet, within that ache was a strange sense of comfort, a feeling that George's life had touched others as deeply as it had touched hers. When Margaret arrived at the care home that morning, the air was brisk and the sky was a pale grey, threatening snow. She clutched a small bouquet of carnations she had picked up on her way, thinking they might brighten someone's room. Ella met her at the front desk, her usual warm smile in place. "Margaret, good morning. Those are lovely," Ella said, nodding at the flowers. "They're for Doris," Margaret replied, her smile soft. "She mentioned missing her garden the other day, and I thought this might cheer her up." Ella's eyes sparkled with appreciation. "You have such a way of making people feel seen, Margaret. It's no wonder everyone here adores you." Margaret blushed lightly. "I think it's mutual, Ella. This place has done as much for me as I hope I've done for it." Ella tilted her head, studying Margaret thoughtfully. "You know, I've been meaning to ask, how are you holding up? After everything with Henry, I mean..." Margaret hesitated, surprised by the question. "I didn't realize you knew." Ella nodded, her expression kind. "Henry told me he was planning to share something with you. He didn't say what, of course, but I could tell it was important to him." Margaret sighed, her grip tightening on the bouquet. "It was unexpected, to say the least, but I'm glad he told me. It's given me a lot to think about." Ella reached out, placing a hand on Margaret's arm. "Sometimes the truth is a gift, even when it's hard to hear. Henry trusts you, and that says a lot. He doesn't open up to many people." Margaret nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and unease. "I feel like I understand him better now. And maybe myself too. It's complicated." "Most worthwhile things are," Ella said with a knowing smile. "If you ever need to talk, I'm here." Margaret felt a surge of warmth at the offer. Ella had been a steady presence since the day she first walked through the care home's doors, her optimism and kindness a constant source of comfort. Now, with Henry's confession fresh in her mind, Margaret realized how much she valued having someone like Ella to lean on. Later that day, after delivering the flowers to Doris and spending time with the residents in the common room, Margaret found herself in the small kitchen where staff prepared tea and snacks. Ella was there, tidying up after the afternoon rush. Margaret hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. "Ella," she began, her voice tentative, "can I ask you something?" Ella turned, her hands stilling as she noticed Margaret's serious expression. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Margaret clasped her hands in front of her, her gaze dropping briefly to the floor. "Do you think it's possible to carry two truths at once? To hold on to the love you had for someone while also learning things about them that change how you see them?" Ella's face softened and she leaned against the counter, her arms crossed loosely. I think it's not only possible, Margaret. It's human. Love isn't about knowing everything about someone. It's about choosing to embrace the whole of who they are, even when it's messy or complicated. Margaret let the words sink in, feeling their weight settle gently over her heart. I suppose I always thought I knew George completely, but now, with what Henry told me, it's like I'm seeing a new side of him, and it's beautiful in its own way, but also bittersweet. Ella stepped closer, her voice kind but firm. That's the thing about love, isn't it? It's never just one thing. It's layers and shades, moments and memories, and it sounds like George gave you something rare, a love that was deep and true, even if it had complexities you didn't know about. Margaret nodded, her throat tightening. I feel like I've been carrying his memory in a box, tied up neatly with a bow. But now the box is open and everything feels different. That's not a bad thing, Ella said gently. It means you're still growing, still discovering new ways to love him. And in a way, that keeps him alive, doesn't it? Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away, offering Ella a small, grateful smile. Thank you. I needed to hear that. Ella reached out, squeezing Margaret's hand briefly. Anytime. That evening, as Margaret prepared to leave, she stopped by Henry's room. He was dozing lightly, his head tilted back against the chair, but he stirred as she entered. His eyes opened, and he offered her a faint smile. "Margaret," he said, his voice raspy. "Back again so soon?" "I just wanted to check on you," she replied, pulling a chair closer to his. "I've been thinking about what you told me." Henry nodded, his expression unreadable. "I thought you might be." "I'm grateful you shared it with me," Margaret said softly. "It's helped me see George and you in a new light." Henry studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I'm glad. I didn't want to keep it hidden any longer." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the room quiet except for the faint hum of the radiator. Margaret felt a sense of peace settle over her, the weight of the past balanced by the present moment. She realized then that the truths Henry had shared, though unexpected, had given her a deeper understanding of love, its complexities, its contradictions, and its enduring power to connect. Margaret sat by her kitchen window the following morning, cradling a cup of tea in her hands. The house was quiet, as always, but her thoughts were loud, swirling with everything that had happened in the past few days. Henry's revelation lingered in her mind, not as a weight, but as a question she wasn't sure how to answer. Could she bridge the gaps in her family while finding a place for the community she had built at the care home? The phone rang, breaking her reverie. She reached for it, her heart quickening as she saw Peter's name on the screen. It was rare for him to call, and rarer still for him to do so without prompting. "Peter, how lovely to hear from you," Margaret said, her voice warm despite her surprise. "Hi, Mum," Peter replied, his tone brisk. "I wanted to check in. How's everything going?" Margaret hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It's been good, busy, in fact. I've been spending a lot of time at the care home." "The care home," Peter repeated, his voice tinged with confusion. "Why? Are you volunteering or something?" "Yes," Margaret said. "I started a few weeks ago. It's been meaningful." Peter's pause was long enough for Margaret to sense his disapproval before he spoke again. "Mum, don't you think you're taking on too much? I mean, at your age, shouldn't you be focusing on taking care of yourself?" Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "Peter, I am taking care of myself. More than I have in years, actually. The people at the care home, they've become a part of my life." "I'm not saying it's a bad thing," Peter said quickly. "I just don't want you to get too caught up in something that might be overwhelming." Margaret felt a flicker of frustration rise within her. Peter, I appreciate your concern, but I'm perfectly capable of deciding what's best for me. And frankly, I found more connection there than I have waiting for phone calls that rarely come." Her words hung in the air, heavier than she intended. Peter's silence was palpable. "That's not fair, Mom," he said finally, his voice defensive. "You know how busy things are for me, and you know how quiet things are for me," Margaret replied, her voice softening but losing none of its resolve. "Peter, I love you, but I've spent too many years waiting for you and your siblings to make time for me. I needed to find something else to fill that space." There was another pause, shorter this time. "I'll call more often," Peter said, though his tone lacked conviction. "I'll try. That's all I ask," Margaret said gently. "And Peter, maybe you could come visit, meet the people at the care home. I think it would do you good." "I don't know, Mom." "I'll think about it," Peter replied, clearly eager to end the conversation. "I've got to go. We'll talk soon." Margaret hung up, her heart heavy despite the small progress they had made. She stared at the phone for a moment before deciding to call Anna. The conversation with her daughter began on a warmer note, but the mention of the care home sparked a similar reaction. "Mom, you shouldn't have to spend your time taking care of other people," Anna said, her voice tinged with worry. "You've done enough of that for a lifetime." "I don't see it that way," Margaret replied. "Being there has given me a sense of purpose I didn't realize I was missing. And it's not just about them, Anna, it's about me too." Anna sighed. "I just don't want you to burn yourself out. And honestly, Mom, I feel guilty knowing you're out there doing all this while I can barely manage my own life." Margaret's heart softened at Anna's admission. "Anna, I don't want you to feel guilty. This isn't about you or Peter or David. It's about me finding something that makes me feel alive again. That's all." "I know, Mom," Anna said quietly. I feel like I've let you down." Margaret's throat tightened. "You haven't, Anna. You've given me so much to be proud of, but I need you to understand that I've had to find my own way, just as you found yours." They spoke for a while longer, the tension easing slightly, though Margaret sensed the conversation had left Anna unsettled. When the call ended, Margaret sat back in her chair, feeling both relief and exhaustion. Her words had been honest, but honesty, she knew, often came at a cost. That afternoon, as she arrived at the care home, Margaret found Ella in the common area, chatting with Mabel. The warmth of their smiles as they greeted her felt like a balm. "You look like you've had a morning," Ella said as Margaret sat down beside her. Margaret sighed. "I had conversations with Peter and Anna. Let's just say they're not entirely thrilled about my time here." Ella's expression softened. "It's hard for them, I'm sure. Seeing you forge your own path might make them realize they've taken your presence for granted." "Perhaps," Margaret said, though the thought brought little comfort. "I just wish they could understand how much this place has meant to me." "They will, in time," Ella said. "And if they don't, that's their journey, not yours. You found something here, Margaret, something worth holding on to." Margaret nodded, letting Ella's words sink in. As she looked around the room, at the familiar faces and the quiet hum of life, she felt a surge of gratitude for the path she had chosen. It was not an easy one, but it was hers. And for now, that was enough. The care home was unusually quiet as Margaret arrived the next morning, her steps slower than usual. The conversations with Peter and Anna weighed heavily on her, stirring a storm of emotions she couldn't quite name. Though she had found clarity in expressing her feelings, the lingering tension left her wondering if she had pushed too hard, or perhaps not hard enough. Ella greeted her at the door, her observant gaze catching Margaret's weariness. "Good morning, Margaret. You all right?" Margaret forced a smile. "I'm fine, Ella. Just a lot on my mind." Ella nodded knowingly. "Let me know if you need an ear." Margaret appreciated the offer, but felt too unsettled to confide in anyone yet. Instead, she made her way to the common room, where Doris and Mabel were sitting with their knitting projects spread across the table. Their laughter warmed the space, a reminder of the camaraderie Margaret had grown to cherish. "Margaret, there you are," Doris said brightly, waving her needles. "We were just saying how dull this place would be without you." Mabel nodded in agreement. "Come sit with us. You can help me figure out this infernal pattern. I swear it's written in some secret code." Margaret chuckled and joined them, grateful for the distraction. As she untangled Mabel's yarn and deciphered the instructions, the tension in her chest began to ease. Here, among these women, life felt simple and whole, free from the complexities that came with family. But the respite was short-lived. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and when Margaret saw Anna's name on the screen, her stomach clenched. Excusing herself, she stepped into the hallway and answered. "Anna, hello?" she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Hi, Mom," Anna replied, her tone hesitant. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about the care home and everything." Margaret leaned against the wall, bracing herself. "I'm glad to hear that, Anna. I hope it gave you some perspective." "It did," Anna said, though her voice carried an edge. "But it also made me realize something. You've been doing all of this, volunteering, building this new life, and you didn't think to tell us. Don't you think that's a little unfair?" Margaret blinked, caught off guard. "Unfair? Anna, I've spent years trying to involve you and your brothers in my life. And most of the time, it felt like I was shouting into a void." "I know, Mom," Anna said quickly. "I'm not saying we've been perfect, but maybe if you told us what you were going through, we could have done more." Margaret's frustration flared. "Anna, I've tried. I've reached out, left messages, sent invitations that were ignored." "What more could I have done?" Anna's silence was deafening, and Margaret pressed on, her voice shaking with the force of emotion she could no longer contain. "You and Peter and David have your own lives, and I understand that. But what about mine? Am I supposed to sit in an empty house, waiting for a phone call that might never come? I found something at the care home, a sense of purpose, of belonging. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then maybe you need to ask yourself why." "I'm not uncomfortable," Anna said, her voice softer now. I feel like I've failed you, Mum, like we all have." The vulnerability in Anna's tone tugged at Margaret's heart. "Anna, you haven't failed me. I love you, all of you, more than you can imagine. But I can't keep waiting for you to fill the spaces in my life. I had to do that for myself." There was a long pause before Anna spoke again, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to say, Mom. I feel like I've let you down in ways I can't fix." Margaret's voice softened, though the ache in her chest remained. "Anna, we've all let each other down at some point, but it's not too late to do better. That's all I'm asking." When the call ended, Margaret leaned against the wall, her energy drained. She had said what needed to be said, but the exchange left her feeling raw, her emotions exposed like an open wound. Returning to the common room, she found Ella waiting for her near the door. One look at Margaret's face, and Ella's expression shifted to one of quiet concern. "Rough call?" Ella asked. Margaret nodded, sinking into a chair. "It feels like I've opened a door I can't close, and I don't know what's on the other side." Ella sat beside her, her voice gentle. "Sometimes those are the doors we need to open the most. It's messy, yes, but that's how we grow." Margaret sighed, her gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady. "I just hope it leads somewhere worth going." Ella placed a reassuring hand on Margaret's arm. "It will. Give it time." That evening, as Margaret prepared to leave, she stopped by Henry's room. He was awake, his gaze fixed on the window, and he turned as she entered. "You look like you've had a day," he said, his tone wry. Margaret smiled faintly. "You could say that." She sat down beside him, and they talked about everything and nothing, their conversation a soothing balm for the day's wounds. As Margaret listened to Henry's steady voice, she felt a glimmer of hope return. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she felt strong enough to walk it, one step at a time. Margaret spent the next few days in a quiet contemplation that seemed to stretch into every corner of her life. The conversations with Peter and Anna had left her feeling both drained and resolute. She had spoken her truth, however messy it had been. And while the responses from her children had been far from perfect, a door had indeed been opened. Now, standing at the threshold, Margaret found herself wondering what her next step should be. She sat by her kitchen window one morning, watching the frost shimmer in the pale sunlight, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. Her thoughts turned to the care home, to Henry, Doris, Mabel, and Ella, the new family she had found in the most unexpected of places. These relationships, though fresh, had brought her a kind of comfort and strength she hadn't realized she needed. They had become her safe harbor, yet the pull of her children, the bond of family, remained tender and persistent. As the tea grew cold in her hands, an idea began to form. It was bold, perhaps even a little foolish, but it stirred a sense of purpose in her chest. What if she could bring her two worlds together? What if her children could meet the people who had brought her back to life, see the place that had given her a renewed sense of belonging? The idea took root quickly, growing stronger with each passing hour. By the time Margaret arrived at the care home later that day, she was brimming with nervous excitement. She found Ella in the common area, arranging chairs for an afternoon gathering. "Ella, do you have a moment?" Margaret asked, her voice steady but tinged with anticipation. Ella looked up, her smile warm and inviting. "Of course, Margaret. What's on your mind?" Margaret sat down beside her, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. "I've been thinking about Christmas and everything that's happened since. I want to do something that might bring my family closer." Ella tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Go on." "I want to host another Christmas celebration," Margaret said, her words spilling out in a rush. "Here, at the care home. But this time, I want to invite my children. I want them to meet everyone, to see what this place has meant to me." Ella's eyes lit up with understanding. "Margaret, that's a wonderful idea. It could be just what your family needs." Margaret nodded, her heart racing. "I don't know if they'll come. Things are complicated. But I have to try." Ella reached over, placing a reassuring hand on Margaret's arm. "I'll help you plan it. We'll make it a day to remember." The next few days were a flurry of activity as Margaret and Ella worked together to organize the event. Invitations were written, simple, heartfelt notes to Peter, Anna, and David, explaining what the care home had come to mean to her and how much she wished for them to be a part of it, even if only for a day. Margaret pored over every word, her hands trembling slightly as she sealed each envelope. She mailed them with a prayer, knowing the outcome was beyond her control. At the care home, preparations were in full swing. Residents were enlisted to help with decorations, their enthusiasm infectious. Doris and Mabel took charge of creating festive table centerpieces, while Henry grumbled good-naturedly as he was persuaded to contribute his advice on the seating arrangement. "Don't put me too close to the door," Henry said, his tone dry but his eyes twinkling. "I might be tempted to make an early escape." Margaret laughed, the sound light and genuine. "You'll stay, Henry. I'll make sure of it." As the day of the event approached, Margaret's nerves grew. The invitations had been sent, but there had been no word from her children. Each day she checked her phone, her heart sinking a little more with each silent hour. Yet she refused to let the uncertainty dampen her resolve. Whether or not they came, she would make the day special for the people who had become her second family. On the morning of the gathering, the care home was alive with anticipation. Residents dressed in their finest clothes, the scent of baked goods filled the air, and the decorations sparkled in the soft glow of twinkling lights. Margaret arrived early, her heart both heavy and hopeful as she helped Ella with the final touches. As the first guests began to arrive, friends and family of the residents, Margaret kept glancing toward the door, her breath catching each time it opened. Hours passed, and though she smiled and mingled, her eyes never strayed far from the entrance. Finally, just as the sun began to set, the door opened once more. Margaret turned, her breath hitching as she saw Anna step inside, her coat dusted with snow. Behind her was Peter, looking slightly uncomfortable but determined, and trailing them both was David, his hands shoved into his pockets. Margaret's heart swelled, her vision blurring with tears. She hurried toward them, her arms opening instinctively. "You came," she whispered, her voice breaking as she embraced each of them in turn. Anna smiled, her eyes glistening. "We couldn't let you do this alone, Mum." Peter nodded, his expression softening. "You were right. It was time." David grinned sheepishly. "Besides, who can resist free food?" Margaret laughed through her tears, holding her children close for a moment longer before leading them into the warm, lively room. The residents greeted them with open arms, and soon the space was filled with laughter and conversation as two worlds began to blend, tentative but genuine. As Margaret watched her children speak with Doris and Mabel, and saw Peter and Henry exchanging words with a surprising ease, a deep sense of peace settled over her. For the first time in years, she felt the possibility of healing, of bridges being built across the divides of time and distance. It was a bold plan, yes, but in that moment, surrounded by love and connection, Margaret knew it had been worth the risk. The day of Margaret's Christmas celebration dawned with a bright, crisp sky and a biting chill in the air. Snow from the previous week had hardened into an icy crust, crunching underfoot as Margaret hurried into the care home. The residents were abuzz with excitement, their energy palpable despite the early hour. Ella was already there, her sleeves rolled up as she directed the last-minute preparations. "Margaret, thank goodness!" Ella called, waving her over. "The caterer just called. They're delayed because of the weather, and the band we hired, their van broke down. We might have to improvise." Margaret took a steadying breath, setting down the tin of cookies she had brought for the dessert table. "We'll make do, Ella. We always do." But as the morning unfolded, it became clear that the day would test Margaret's resolve. By noon, the snow clouds that had seemed distant at dawn began to gather, thick and grey, promising another storm. Guests who had planned to travel from out of town started calling, regretfully cancelling their attendance. Ella's cheerful optimism faltered as the list of setbacks grew longer. Margaret felt the weight of each disappointment, but she refused to let it dampen her determination. The residents had dressed in their finest, their faces alight with anticipation, and she knew she couldn't let them down. Moving through the room, she offered words of encouragement, her own spirits lifting as she saw their excitement. "Mrs. Ellis," Doris called from her seat near the window, waving Margaret over. "Mabel says she's ready to play the piano if the band doesn't show. She might be rusty, but it'll be better than nothing." Margaret smiled warmly. "Tell Mabel to get ready. We'll make her the star of the show." As she turned to help Ella with the refreshments, the care home's front door opened, and a gust of icy wind swept through the room. Margaret glanced up, her heart skipping as she saw Anna step inside, bundled in a heavy coat dusted with snow. Behind her, Peter followed, carrying a large bag, and David trailed after them, his scarf wrapped haphazardly around his neck. "Mom!" Anna called, her smile tentative but warm. "We made it!" Margaret hurried over, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and joy. "You came! Oh, I was so worried the weather would keep you away." "It almost did," Peter admitted, his expression softening. "But we couldn't let you down," David grinned, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "Besides, I heard there's free food." Margaret laughed, pulling each of them into a tight hug. For a moment, the chaos of the day faded, replaced by the warmth of having her children by her side. She led them into the common room, introducing them to Ella and the residents, who welcomed them with open arms. As the afternoon wore on, the celebration began to take shape despite the earlier setbacks. Mabel's piano playing, though slightly uneven, brought laughter and applause from the crowd, and Doris led a spirited sing-along that filled the room with holiday cheer. Anna and Peter mingled with the residents, their initial hesitation melting away as they listened to stories and shared memories. Even David, who had seemed most skeptical, found himself deep in conversation with Henry, the two of them laughing over a shared joke. Margaret moved through the room, her heart full as she watched her two worlds begin to intertwine. She caught Ella's eye across the room, and they exchanged a smile that spoke volumes. The day was far from perfect, but it was unfolding in ways Margaret hadn't dared to hope. As dusk approached, the snowstorm intensified, and Ella announced that the guests would need to leave early to ensure they could travel safely. Margaret felt a pang of disappointment, but she knew it was the right decision. She stood by the door, bidding farewell to each family member and friend who had come, her heart warmed by their words of gratitude and encouragement. When it came time for Anna, Peter, and David to leave, Margaret lingered with them in the foyer, reluctant to see them go. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It means more than I can say." Anna reached out, squeezing her mother's hand. "I'm glad we came, Mom. This place, it's special. I can see why it's so important to you." Peter nodded, his expression serious. "You've built something here, Mom. And I think maybe we've been too focused on our own lives to see that." David smiled, his tone light but sincere. "Next time, let's make it a family tradition. You cook, we'll bring the charm." Margaret laughed through her tears, pulling them into one last embrace. As she watched them drive away, their car disappearing into the snowstorm, a deep sense of peace settled over her. The day had not gone as planned, but it had brought her family closer in a way she hadn't thought possible. Returning to the common room, Margaret found Henry still seated by the window, a faint smile on his face. "Your kids seem all right," he said, his tone gruff but kind. "They are," Margaret replied, sitting beside him. "And today, I think they finally understood why this place means so much to me." Henry nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air." Margaret smiled, her heart full of gratitude. The storm outside raged on, but inside, surrounded by the people she cared for most, Margaret felt a warmth that no snow could touch. The morning after, the storm brought a stillness to the care home that felt almost reverent. Outside, the snow lay thick and unbroken, shimmering in the pale light of dawn. Inside, the air was warm with the lingering sense of celebration from the day before. Margaret walked through the halls, pausing occasionally to greet the residents, her steps lighter than they had been in years. Her heart was full, though she couldn't quite name the emotion that filled her as she reflected on her children's visit. It was not the dramatic reconciliation she might have once dreamed of, but it had been real, grounded in the moments they had shared and the small steps toward understanding. It felt like the beginning of something new, and for that she was profoundly grateful. As she reached the common area, she found Ella sitting at a table, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. Ella looked up with a smile, motioning for Margaret to join her. "Well, Margaret," Ella said, her voice warm. "How does it feel to have pulled off what some might call a Christmas miracle?" Margaret chuckled softly, sitting across from her. "It wasn't perfect, but it was more than I could have hoped for. Having Anna, Peter, and David here, it felt like a gift." "They seem to fit right in," Ella remarked. "Especially Anna. She stayed close to Doris most of the afternoon." "I think they hit it off." Margaret nodded, the image of Anna sitting beside Doris, her head bent as she listened intently to the older woman's stories, still fresh in her mind. "I saw that. Doris has a way of drawing people in." "And Peter," Ella continued, her tone thoughtful. "He was quieter, but I saw him talking to Henry for quite a while. I'd love to know what they were discussing." Margaret smiled faintly. "I imagine Henry had plenty to say." "He's never been one to hold back his opinions," Ella laughed, then leaned forward, her expression growing serious. "Margaret, you've done something remarkable here. I hope you realize that bringing your family into this place, into this part of your life, it's not easy, but it's important." "I know," Margaret replied softly. "It felt right. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were moving in the same direction. Even if it's just a small step." Ella reached out, covering Margaret's hand with her own. "That's all it takes, one step at a time." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening, followed by a gust of cold air. Margaret turned, expecting to see a late-arriving guest or a staff member returning from errands. But when her eyes settled on the figure standing in the doorway, her breath caught. It was Peter, his coat dusted with snow, his face flushed from the cold. He carried a small bag in one hand and looked around the room as though searching for someone. When his eyes met Margaret's, his expression softened. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "I hope I'm not too late." Margaret stood, her heart racing. "Peter, what are you doing here?" Peter walked toward her, his steps deliberate. "I couldn't stop thinking about yesterday. About what you said, about this place, about everything. I realized I needed to come back." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them away, her smile trembling. "I'm so glad you're here." They sat together at the table, Peter setting the bag down with a faint smile. "I brought some things for the residents," he said, pulling out a stack of books and puzzles. "I thought they might like them." Margaret's heart swelled with pride. "That's so thoughtful, Peter. They'll love it." As the morning unfolded, Peter surprised Margaret with his willingness to engage. He visited Henry, their conversation carrying the same quiet intensity Margaret had noticed the day before. He spent time with Mabel, patiently listening as she explained the intricacies of a knitting project she'd been working on for weeks. And when Ella suggested a group activity to lift everyone's spirits, Peter joined without hesitation, helping to arrange chairs and encouraging the residents to participate. Watching him, Margaret felt a flicker of hope, a sense that the gaps between them, so wide for so long, might finally be closing. She could see the care and intention in his actions, the way he listened and responded, not out of obligation, but from a genuine desire to connect. But even amidst her joy, a shadow lingered. Anna had called that morning to say she couldn't return. The storm had made travel impossible, and she didn't want to risk the trip with the children. Margaret understood, of course, but her absence left an ache she couldn't quite shake. As the day wore on, Margaret found herself sitting with Peter near the window, the light outside growing dim. The snow continued to fall, soft and steady, creating a sense of quiet that seemed to echo their thoughts. "Mom," Peter said suddenly, breaking the silence, "I owe you an apology." Margaret turned to him, her brows furrowing. "For what?" "For being so distant," Peter said, his voice heavy with regret. "I've let work and everything else take priority for far too long. And I didn't see what that was doing to you or to me. Margaret reached out, placing her hand over his. Peter, you've always done your best. I know that, and I've never stopped being proud of you. Peter looked at her, his eyes filled with emotion. I want to do better, Mom. I want to be here for you, not just in words, but in actions. Tears filled Margaret's eyes, and she nodded, her voice trembling. That's all I've ever wanted. As the snow fell outside and the care home buzzed with quiet activity, Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time, she felt truly accompanied. With Peter by her side and the warmth of this place that had become her second home, Margaret knew she was no longer alone. The snowstorm that had blanketed the town for days showed no signs of relenting. By mid-afternoon, the care home was wrapped in an eerie quiet, its usual hum softened by the muffled sounds of wind and snowfall outside. Margaret had spent much of the morning with Peter, watching as he continued to interact with the residents. It filled her with pride to see him so at ease, so present in a way she hadn't witnessed in years. As they sat in the common room, Henry wheeled himself over, his expression unusually somber. Margaret greeted him warmly, but her cheer faded as she noticed the pallor in his face. "Henry, are you feeling all right?" she asked, leaning forward in concern. "I'm fine," he said gruffly, though his voice lacked its usual strength. "Just tired." Peter, sitting nearby, caught the exchange and stood. "Do you want me to call someone, Mum?" Margaret hesitated, studying Henry's face. His breathing seemed labored, his shoulders rising and falling with visible effort. "Yes, Peter, find Ella." Peter left quickly, and Margaret turned back to Henry. She reached for his hand, her heart tightening at how frail it felt in hers. "Henry, let me take you to your room. You need to rest." "I'm fine here," Henry insisted, but his resistance was half-hearted. Margaret called for another staff member, and together they helped Henry back to his room. By the time Ella arrived, Henry had sunk into his chair, his breathing shallow. Ella's face, usually so composed, betrayed her worry as she checked his vitals. "We need to get him to the hospital," she said quietly, her voice firm but calm. "This isn't something we can manage here." Margaret's heart clenched. The thought of Henry in a hospital, surrounded by strangers, filled her with dread. But she knew Ella was right. Peter returned as they were making arrangements for the ambulance. "I'll drive you, Mom," he said immediately, sensing her hesitation. "You shouldn't go alone." Margaret nodded, grateful for his support. As the paramedics arrived and prepared to transport Henry, she leaned down to speak to him. "I'm coming with you," she said softly, brushing a hand over his. "You're not doing this alone." Henry's eyes opened briefly, his gaze meeting hers with a flicker of gratitude. "Thank you, Margaret," he murmured, his voice barely audible. The drive to the hospital was slow and tense, the snow making the roads treacherous. Peter focused on the road, his jaw tight, while Margaret sat silently beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, heavy and unrelenting. When they reached the hospital, the emergency staff took Henry immediately, leaving Margaret and Peter to wait in the sterile, brightly lit hallway. The minutes dragged into an hour, then two, each passing moment filled with silence, broken only by the occasional shuffle of nurses or the beep of machines. Peter finally spoke, his voice low. "Mom, you didn't have to come. They'd have taken care of him." Margaret shook her head, her gaze fixed on the door Henry had disappeared through. "It's not about that, Peter. Henry's more than just a friend. He's family now. You'd understand if you spent more time with him." Peter didn't respond, but the weight of her words seemed to settle on him. He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Hours later, a doctor emerged, her face calm but serious. Margaret stood immediately, her hands gripping the back of the chair for support. "Are you Mrs. Ellis?" the doctor asked. Margaret nodded. "Yes. How is he?" "He's stable for now, but it was a close call," the doctor said. "He has a history of heart issues, and this episode was severe. We've admitted him for observation and treatment, but he'll need to make some significant lifestyle changes." Margaret exhaled, relief washing over her. "Can I see him?" The doctor hesitated, then nodded. "Briefly, he's resting." Margaret followed the nurse down the hallway, Peter close behind her. When they reached Henry's room, she paused in the doorway, her heart aching at the sight of him. He looked small and fragile in the hospital bed, his skin pale against the crisp white sheets, but his eyes opened as she approached, and a faint smile touched his lips. "You didn't have to come," he said, his voice raspy but steady. Margaret sat beside him, taking his hand. "Don't be ridiculous. You know I wouldn't be anywhere else." Henry's gaze softened, and for a moment the room seemed to shrink, the world outside falling away. "Thank you, Margaret, for everything." Peter stood at the foot of the bed, his hands in his pockets. "Henry," he said, his voice awkward but sincere, "I'm glad you're okay. And, I'd like to get to know you better." Henry chuckled faintly, his smile widening. "Well, that's a first. Someone actually wants to talk to me." Margaret laughed through her tears, the tension of the day easing slightly. She stayed by Henry's side until he drifted off to sleep, her heart full of gratitude for his recovery, even as the weight of the day lingered. As they left the hospital, the snow had finally stopped, the world outside blanketed in quiet. Peter helped Margaret into the car, his touch gentle, his expression thoughtful. "You really care about him, don't you?" Peter asked as they drove. Margaret nodded, her voice soft. "He's become part of my life, Peter, and in some ways, part of yours too." Peter glanced at her, his face thoughtful. "I think I'm starting to understand why this place, these people, mean so much to you, Mom." The drive home was quiet but peaceful, the bond between them growing stronger in the stillness. For the first time in years, Margaret felt that she was no longer navigating her life alone. And as the care home came into view, its lights glowing warmly against the snow, she knew that both her family and her newfound community had begun to intertwine in ways she had once only dreamed of. The days following Henry's hospitalization were marked by a quiet determination in Margaret. She returned to the care home, her visits more deliberate, her presence steady and comforting for the residents and staff. But her thoughts often strayed to Henry, and she found herself checking her phone throughout the day, hoping for updates on his recovery. Ella, ever perceptive, noticed Margaret's unease as they worked together in the common room one morning. They were arranging a fresh set of holiday decorations, a task meant to bring cheer to the lingering wintry days. "Margaret," Ella said gently, pausing to adjust a garland. "Have you heard anything from the hospital?" Margaret sighed, setting down a string of lights. "Not since yesterday evening. They said he was stable, but I can't help worrying. Henry doesn't like hospitals. He'll hate being there." Ella smiled faintly. "It's not easy for him, I'm sure, but knowing you're thinking of him, knowing you've been there, that matters more than you realize." Margaret nodded, her gaze distant. "I just wish I could do more." "You already have," Ella assured her, "and you're not alone in this, Margaret. Everyone here cares about Henry. We'll get through this together." Margaret was touched by Ella's words, but it wasn't until later that she truly understood their depth. That afternoon, as she settled into the library with a cup of tea, Peter arrived unexpectedly. He carried a small bouquet of flowers, their bright colors a stark contrast to the grey winter light outside. "Peter," Margaret said, rising to greet him, "what are you doing here?" Peter shrugged, his expression sheepish. "I thought you might like some company, and I wanted to bring these for Henry when you see him next." Margaret took the flowers, her heart swelling. "That's so thoughtful of you." "Thank you." They sat together, the quiet warmth of the library wrapping around them like a blanket. For the first time in years, Margaret felt an ease with her son, a sense of closeness that had once seemed lost. Their conversation flowed naturally, moving from light-hearted anecdotes about the residents to more personal reflections. "Mom," Peter said after a pause, his voice steady but thoughtful, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About this place and about Henry." Margaret looked at him, her expression encouraging. And I think I've been so caught up in my own life that I forgot to see yours," Peter admitted, his gaze meeting hers. "I see it now, though, what this place has given you, what you've given them." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, but she held them back, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "Peter, that means more to me than you know." Later that evening, as Margaret prepared to leave, she received a call from the hospital. The nurse informed her that Henry's condition had improved significantly and that he would be discharged the following day. Relief flooded Margaret, and she shared the news with Ella and Peter, their collective joy filling the room. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the hospital with Peter by her side. Henry was sitting up in bed when they entered, his face pale, but his eyes sharp with their usual wit. "Well, if it isn't the cavalry," he said, his voice raspy but laced with humor. "Come to rescue me from this prison." Margaret laughed, the sound light and genuine. "You're not getting rid of us that easily, Henry." Peter stepped forward, the bouquet of flowers in hand. "These are for you," he said, his tone awkward but sincere. "Thought they might brighten your room." Henry raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Flowers, huh? You must really like me." Peter chuckled, setting the flowers on the bedside table. "Don't get used to it." The exchange warmed Margaret's heart, and she felt a newfound bond growing between the two men. She stayed with Henry as the nurse explained his discharge instructions, listening carefully to ensure he would follow them. When they returned to the care home later that day, the residents greeted Henry with cheers and laughter, their joy palpable. Doris was the first to approach, her knitting needles clutched tightly in her hands. "Henry, you old rascal, you had us worried sick." "I missed you too, Doris," Henry replied with a wry smile. Mabel joined in, placing a blanket over Henry's lap as he settled into his chair. "You're not allowed to scare us like that again, you hear?" Henry chuckled, his gaze softening as he looked around the room. "I'll do my best." As the evening wore on, Margaret found herself surrounded by a sense of community that felt stronger than ever. Peter stayed for dinner, chatting easily with the residents and even helping Ella serve dessert. Margaret watched him with a quiet pride, her heart full as she saw the connections forming before her eyes. When Peter prepared to leave, he hugged Margaret tightly, his voice low and earnest. "I'll come back soon, Mom, I promise." Margaret nodded, her eyes shining. "I'll hold you to that." As she returned to the common room, where Henry was regaling a small group with one of his stories, Margaret felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had seen strength in unexpected places, within herself, her children, and the community she had come to call home. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in years, Margaret felt truly surrounded by love and support, and in that moment, she knew she could face whatever came next. The morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of crisp winter day that seemed to cleanse the world of its burdens. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching the sunlight dance over the snow-covered rooftops. The previous days had been full of highs and lows, Henry's recovery, Peter's unexpected warmth, and the quiet resolve she had found in her growing community at the care home. But today, she felt a deeper stillness, a moment to reflect on how far she had come. By mid-morning, Margaret was at the care home, greeted by Ella's cheerful smile as she entered. The staff bustled about, preparing for a small gathering to celebrate Henry's return. Margaret had spent the night baking her famous shortbread, and she carried the tin carefully as she made her way to the common room. "Margaret, you're spoiling us again," Ella teased, her eyes twinkling. "I think the residents look forward to your treats more than anything else." Margaret laughed softly. "Well, they deserve it. And I can't deny, baking helps clear my mind." As the morning unfolded, Margaret found herself immersed in the preparations, her hands busy but her thoughts restless. The time spent with Peter had been healing, but she couldn't shake the lingering ache of Anna's absence. Though Anna had sent messages and called to check on Henry, she hadn't returned to the care home since the storm. Margaret longed to see her, to bridge the gap that had widened between them over the years. Just as the gathering was beginning, Margaret's phone buzzed in her pocket. She stepped into the hallway to answer, her heart skipping when she saw Anna's name on the screen. "Anna?" Margaret said, her voice warm but cautious. "It's good to hear from you." "Hi, Mom," Anna replied, her tone hesitant. "I wanted to let you know I'm on my way. I'll be there in about an hour." Margaret's breath caught. "Oh, Anna, that's wonderful. I can't wait to see you." "Me too," Anna said softly. "And Mom, there's something I want to talk about, something I've been thinking about since Christmas." Margaret's heart tightened with both anticipation and anxiety. "Of course, dear. We'll talk when you get here." The call ended, and Margaret leaned against the wall, her thoughts racing. She returned to the common room, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the shortbread on the refreshment table. Ella noticed immediately, her brow furrowing in concern. "Everything all right?" Ella asked quietly. Margaret nodded, managing a small smile. "Anna's coming. She wants to talk." Ella's face softened with understanding. "That's a good sign, Margaret. Whatever it is, you'll face it together." Margaret found comfort in Ella's words, though the hours that followed felt both swift and endless. The residents gathered in the common room, their laughter and chatter filling the air as they celebrated Henry's return. Henry, though still pale, was in good spirits, teasing Doris and Mabel as they fussed over him. When Anna arrived, the sight of her daughter standing in the doorway momentarily took Margaret's breath away. Anna carried herself with a mixture of determination and vulnerability, her coat draped over one arm as she glanced around the room. Margaret hurried to her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Anna," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion, "I'm so glad you're here." "I'm glad too, Mom," Anna replied, her smile tentative. "This place, it's lovely. I can see why it means so much to you." Margaret led Anna into the room, introducing her to Ella and the residents who had become so dear to her. Anna listened attentively, her eyes softening as she spoke with Doris, who regaled her with tales of her younger days. Margaret watched from a distance, her heart swelling with both pride and relief. Later, as the gathering wound down and the residents began to retire to their rooms, Margaret and Anna found a quiet corner to sit. The sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over their faces. "Mum," Anna began, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how you've felt forgotten, and I realized that you're right. I've been so caught up in my own life that I didn't see how much you needed us." Margaret reached out, covering Anna's hands with her own. "Anna, I never meant to make you feel guilty. I missed you, all of you, and I needed to find something that gave my life meaning again." "I understand that now," Anna said, her voice trembling. "And I'm so sorry, Mom, for not being there, for letting you carry so much on your own." Tears filled Margaret's eyes, and she squeezed Anna's hands tightly. "Oh, Anna, I've made mistakes too. I've let my pride get in the way, and I haven't always told you how much you mean to me. But it's never too late, is it? We can still make things better." Anna nodded, her own tears spilling over. "I want to, Mom. I want us to have the kind of relationship we used to. And I want to be part of your life here with these wonderful people." Margaret smiled through her tears, pulling Anna into an embrace. "That's all I've ever wanted." As they sat together, the weight of past hurts began to lift, replaced by a quiet hope. Margaret felt the threads of her family's love weaving together again, strong and unbroken. It was a gift she hadn't dared to imagine, but one she knew she would cherish forever. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the snow outside, Margaret felt, for the first time in years, truly whole. The days following Anna's visit passed with a newfound lightness in Margaret's heart. The care home was bustling as usual, but Margaret moved through its familiar halls with a quiet joy she hadn't felt in years. Anna's words lingered in her mind, like a melody she kept returning to, promises of connection, of shared effort, of a family re-knit after years of distance. Henry had returned to his usual spot near the window, his health improving steadily under the watchful eyes of Ella and the care home staff. Margaret visited him often, and their conversations took on a lighter tone, infused with the humor that had always defined their friendship. "You're looking much better," Margaret remarked one afternoon as she sat beside him, knitting in her lap. Henry gave a mock frown, though his eyes twinkled. "Don't tell me you were worried. I thought you'd enjoy the peace and quiet while I was out of commission." Margaret laughed, shaking her head. "You know better than that. This place isn't the same without your grumbling." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the soft hum of the care home wrapping around them like a blanket. Margaret's thoughts drifted to her children, and she felt a pang of longing for Anna's next visit, for Peter's growing attentiveness, and for David's light-hearted humor. But it was a longing softened by hope. Hope that their bond, though tested, was mending. Later that day, as Margaret returned home, she found herself drawn to a small box tucked away in the corner of her sitting room. It was one she hadn't opened in years, filled with keepsakes from her children's younger days, handwritten cards, crayon drawings, and photographs that captured fleeting moments of joy. As she sifted through the memories, she came across a Christmas card from Peter, written long ago but filled with words that felt timeless. Margaret read the card slowly, her eyes misting as she traced the familiar handwriting. It spoke of gratitude, of love that felt too big to contain, and of a promise to always cherish the family they had built. She smiled, though her heart ached with the weight of those words. They had been written in a time when life felt simpler, when the threads of their connection seemed unbreakable. The next day, Margaret shared the card with Ella, who listened with her characteristic attentiveness as Margaret recounted its history. "Margaret," Ella said thoughtfully, "those words are still true, even if life has pulled you apart for a while. Love doesn't disappear. It might get buried under all the noise, but it's always there, waiting to be uncovered." Margaret nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude for Ella's wisdom. "I think I'm starting to see that. Slowly, but surely." The care home was quieter that afternoon, many of the residents resting after lunch. Margaret found herself wandering to the small library, where she often went to gather her thoughts. As she browsed the shelves, her fingers brushed against the spine of an old poetry book, a gift from her late husband, George, given to her on their first Christmas together. Margaret pulled the book from the shelf, opening it to find George's familiar handwriting scrawled on the inside cover. "To my dearest Margaret, who makes every season bright. All my love, George." The sight of his words brought a lump to her throat, and she sat down, holding the book close. George's presence, though distant, felt nearer in that moment, as if he were reminding her of the love they had shared and the strength it had given her. When Margaret returned to the common room later, she found Henry engaged in a spirited conversation with Peter, who had arrived unexpectedly that afternoon. The sight brought a smile to her face, and she joined them, her heart full as she listened to their banter. "You should have seen the look on her face," Henry was saying, gesturing animatedly as Peter laughed. "She thought I was serious when I said I'd knit my own scarf." Margaret shook her head, amused. "I've learned never to take you too seriously, Henry." Peter turned to her, his smile warm. "I was just telling Henry that I've decided to come back next week. I want to spend more time here, get to know everyone better." Margaret's breath caught, her smile widening. "Peter, that's wonderful. You have no idea how much that means to me." As the evening wore on, the three of them shared stories and laughter, the room filled with a sense of ease that felt both new and familiar. For Margaret, it was a glimpse of what she had longed for: a family not perfect, but present, and a life rich with connection and meaning. Later, as she walked Peter to the door, he paused, his expression thoughtful. "Mum," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about what you said, that love takes work. I'm ready to do that now. I don't want to take you, or this, for granted anymore." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to hug him tightly. "Peter, that's all I've ever wanted, to know that we're trying together." As Peter drove away, Margaret stood at the window, watching his car disappear into the snowy night. The warmth of the care home glowed behind her, a testament to the love and resilience that had carried her through the years. She turned back to the room, her heart light, ready to embrace whatever came next. The snow fell gently outside Margaret's window as she sat by the fire, a cup of tea warming her hands. The day had been quiet at the care home, a calm after the busyness of recent weeks. The events of the past month lingered in her thoughts like chapters of a book she had yet to close. There was much to be grateful for: Henry's recovery, Peter's newfound presence, and the tender reconciliation with Anna. But there was also the bittersweet reality of time, its relentless passing marked by the glow of the fading holiday season. On the small side table next to her chair sat a stack of old Christmas cards. Margaret had brought them out that morning, a spur-of-the-moment decision as she tidied her home. They were a collection spanning years, tucked away in a box she hadn't opened in a long time. As she set down her tea, she reached for the first card, its edges worn but its message timeless. It was a card from Anna, sent during her first year at university. Margaret traced her daughter's neat handwriting, the words a mixture of excitement and homesickness. Anna had written about her classes, her new friends, and how much she missed their family's Christmas traditions. Margaret smiled, remembering the long phone calls they had shared that year. Anna's voice carrying both the thrill of independence and the yearning for home. She picked up another card, this one from David, its front adorned with a cartoon reindeer. His message was simple, scribbled hastily but full of affection. Margaret could almost hear his voice in the words, playful and light-hearted, yet sincere. It was a reminder of his unique way of expressing love, unconventional but unmistakable. Finally, Margaret came to a card from Peter, dated nearly 20 years earlier. She opened it carefully, the faint scent of pine lingering on the paper. His words, written in the bold strokes of his younger self, were full of gratitude. He had thanked her for everything she had done, for the sacrifices she had made to keep their family strong. The card spoke of a connection she had feared lost in recent years, a bond that was now slowly being restored. Margaret sighed, leaning back in her chair. The cards were not just relics of the past, they were windows into her children's lives, into the love that had always been there, even when buried beneath the demands of time and distance. She realized, with a pang, how easily those moments could slip away, how quickly the years could pass without noticing. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint chime of her phone. She reached for it, her heart lifting as she saw Anna's name on the screen. "Hello, Anna," Margaret said, her voice bright. "Hi, Mom," Anna replied, her tone warm but slightly hesitant. "I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all," Margaret assured her. "I was just sitting here thinking of you." "That's good," Anna said softly. "I've been thinking about you too. I wanted to thank you again for everything. The time at the care home, our talk. It's been on my mind." Margaret felt a swell of emotion, her voice steady but tender. "Anna, it meant so much to me that you came, seeing you there, meeting everyone. It was more than I could have hoped for." "I want to come back soon," Anna said, her voice firm. "I don't want it to be like before, Mom. I want us to be closer, to stay connected." Margaret smiled, her heart full. "That's all I've ever wanted, Anna. I'm so proud of you, and I hope you know how much I love you." "I do," Anna replied, her voice catching slightly. "I love you too, Mom." As the call ended, Margaret sat in the quiet glow of the fire, her heart both light and heavy. She knew there was still work to be done, still moments to mend and connections to strengthen, but there was hope now, a flicker of warmth in the cold winter night. She turned her attention back to the cards, carefully tying them together with a ribbon. They were not just memories, they were reminders of the love that had endured through the years. As she placed the bundle back on the table, she resolved to keep them close, not hidden away in a box, but as a testament to the bonds that had shaped her life. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in silence. Margaret sipped her tea, watching the flames dance in the hearth. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the echoes of the past and the promise of the future, she felt a deep sense of peace. For the first time in years, the weight of loneliness had lifted, replaced by the steady, unyielding strength of love. As the weeks passed, the snow that had blanketed the town began to melt, revealing patches of green beneath the icy white. The care home buzzed with its usual rhythm, but there was a renewed sense of hope in its halls. Margaret moved through her days with purpose, her heart lighter, as she found herself more connected to her children and the vibrant community she had helped foster. One crisp morning, Margaret arrived at the care home to find Ella in the common room, arranging a stack of books on the small library cart. The room was bathed in sunlight, the faint scent of fresh flowers lingering from the vases Doris had carefully filled the day before. "Morning, Margaret," Ella greeted warmly. "You're just in time. Doris and Mabel are planning their next knitting project, and they've been waiting for your opinion on the color scheme." Margaret chuckled as she set down her bag. "They always know how to keep me busy." But before she could join the women at their table, Ella motioned her closer. "Actually, there's something I wanted to talk to you about first." "A little idea I've been mulling over." Margaret raised her eyebrows, intrigued. "Go on." "Well," Ella began, leaning against the cart, "you've brought so much life to this place with your Christmas gatherings, and the residents have been talking about it ever since. It got me thinking, what if we made it a tradition? A family-centered event every year where residents and their loved ones can come together, just like you did with your children." Margaret's heart swelled at the suggestion. "Ella, that's a beautiful idea. I'd love to help make it happen." Ella's eyes sparkled. "I knew you'd say that. We'll need your touch to make it special." Over the following weeks, Margaret threw herself into the planning with her characteristic energy. She enlisted Doris and Mabel to help create hand-knit ornaments for the event, while Henry, though skeptical at first, offered his sharp wit to craft a festive reading to entertain the guests. Ella coordinated with the staff, ensuring every detail was thoughtfully arranged, from the decorations to the menu. As the date for the event approached, Margaret sent personal invitations to her children, hopeful they would attend. Though Peter and Anna had visited frequently in recent weeks, Margaret wanted this gathering to be a shared celebration of the journey they had all embarked on together. When the day arrived, the care home transformed into a haven of warmth and joy. The common room was adorned with twinkling lights and garlands, and the scent of mulled cider filled the air. Residents and their families began to arrive, their laughter and chatter creating a lively hum. Margaret's heart swelled as she saw Anna walk through the door with her children, their faces lighting up as they took in the festive atmosphere. Moments later, Peter arrived, carrying a basket of baked goods he had prepared himself, a gesture that touched Margaret deeply. Even David, with his usual playful charm, made his entrance with a bouquet of flowers for Doris, who blushed at the unexpected attention. Margaret moved through the room, greeting guests and marveling at the connections forming before her eyes. She saw Anna helping Mabel arrange a centerpiece, Peter deep in conversation with Henry, and David entertaining a group of residents with his knack for storytelling. The sight filled her with a profound sense of gratitude. Later in the evening, as the guests gathered for a special reading by Henry, Margaret stood at the back of the room, her hands clasped tightly as she watched her family among the crowd. Ella joined her, her expression soft with satisfaction. "Margaret," Ella said quietly, "look at what you've done. This isn't just a tradition, it's a legacy." Margaret smiled, her throat tightening with emotion. "It's not just me, Ella. It's all of us." As the evening wound down, Margaret found herself sitting with her children at a small table near the fireplace. The room was quieter now, the guests slowly beginning to leave, but the warmth of the event lingered. "Mom," Anna said, her voice soft but earnest, "this was incredible. I can see why this place means so much to you." Peter nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's more than a care home, it's a community. And I think I'd like to be part of it more often." David grinned, raising his mug of cider. "Here's to family, old and new." Margaret laughed, her heart full as they clinked their mugs together. For the first time in years, she felt the barriers between them dissolve, replaced by a shared understanding that no distance or time could undo. As the last guests departed and the care home settled into its evening quiet, Margaret lingered by the window, watching the moonlight reflect off the snow-covered garden. She thought of the year that had passed, of the moments of heartache and healing, and of the love that had endured through it all. Ella joined her, wrapping a shawl around Margaret's shoulders. "You've done something remarkable, Margaret." Margaret turned to her friend, her voice steady and full of conviction. "We've all done it, Ella, together." As they stood in the quiet glow of the care home, Margaret felt the beginning of something new, a tradition not just of gatherings, but of connection, resilience, and love. And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the people she held most dear, Margaret knew that the greatest gift was not in the event itself, but in the bonds it had strengthened and the hope it had inspired. The days following the celebration unfolded with a tranquil rhythm. Margaret felt a quiet satisfaction as the care home settled back into its usual routines, though the warmth of the recent gathering lingered in every corner. The memory of her children laughing and mingling with the residents filled her with a profound sense of fulfillment. Yet, as the season crept closer to spring, Margaret couldn't shake a feeling that some small thread, remained unresolved. One bright morning, while dusting her sitting room, Margaret stumbled upon a box she hadn't noticed in years. It was tucked behind a stack of books, its edges worn but intact. The sight of it stirred a mix of curiosity and apprehension. She carried it to her chair, settling in as she carefully lifted the lid. Inside were keepsakes from her late husband, George, a watch, a pair of cufflinks, and an envelope sealed with his familiar handwriting. Margaret's breath caught as she lifted the envelope, her fingers trembling. She recognized it instantly. It was addressed to their children. With her heart pounding, Margaret opened the letter. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded, but George's words were as vivid as ever. He had written it years ago, long before his passing. And it was clear that the letter had been intended for a moment when their children might need a reminder of their family's love. Margaret began to read aloud, her voice trembling. George's words were tender, filled with the quiet strength she had always admired in him. "To my dear Peter, Anna, and David," the letter began, "I want you to know that no matter how far life takes you or how much time passes, you will always have each other, and you will always have your mother. She is the heart of this family, the one who keeps us whole. Cherish her and cherish one another. Love is the thread that binds us, even when it's stretched thin. Never forget that." Margaret's tears spilled freely as she finished the letter. She sat for a long while, clutching the paper to her chest, George's words echoing in her mind. The timing of the discovery felt almost providential, as if George himself had reached across the years to remind their family of the ties they shared. The next day, Margaret brought the letter to the care home. She found Peter in the library, flipping through a book he had borrowed during one of his recent visits. He looked up as she approached, his expression brightening. "Mum," he said, closing the book, "what brings you here so early?" Margaret sat beside him, the letter folded neatly in her hands. "Peter, I found something yesterday. It's from your father." Peter's brow furrowed in curiosity. Margaret unfolded the letter, handing it to him without a word. She watched as he read it, his expression softening, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He wrote this for us?" Peter asked, his voice quiet. Margaret nodded. "He must have written it years ago, but I only just found it. I think he meant for it to remind us of what truly matters." Peter sat back, staring at the letter. Dad had a way of saying the right thing, didn't he, even now? Margaret smiled faintly. "He did, and I think he'd be proud of us for finding our way back to each other." Later that afternoon, Margaret gathered her children in the common room. Anna and David arrived together, their expressions curious as they joined Peter. Margaret waited until they were seated before she handed the letter to Anna. "I want you all to read this," she said softly. "It's from your father." Anna unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the words. As she read, her lips trembled, and she passed the letter to David, who took it with uncharacteristic solemnity. When he finished, the room was quiet, the weight of George's message settling over them. Anna was the first to speak, her voice thick with emotion. "He always believed in us, didn't he, even when we didn't believe in ourselves?" David nodded, his usual humor replaced by a rare seriousness. "It's like he knew we'd need this, Mum, that we'd lose sight of what's important." Peter leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "We can't change the past, but we can honor this. We can do better." Margaret's heart swelled with gratitude as she looked at her children. "That's all I've ever wanted, for us to remember what it means to be a family." They sat together for a long time, their conversation weaving between memories of George and plans for the future. The letter became a touchstone, a reminder of the love that had always bound them, even in times of distance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the snow-dappled garden, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. She knew that George's words had not only mended old wounds, but had also strengthened the foundation of their family. The next morning, Margaret framed the letter and placed it on the mantel in the common room, where it could be a symbol of hope for everyone who entered. It stood as a testament to the enduring power of love, a reminder that no matter how far life took them, they would always have each other. The evening air was crisp as Margaret stepped into the care home's common room, now glowing with the warm light of its many lamps. Residents sat in small groups, some knitting, others playing cards, their conversations weaving a soft hum in the background. Margaret paused at the door, her heart swelling with a deep, quiet contentment. Tonight was special. Her family, Peter, Anna, and David, had all agreed to join her at the care home for an intimate gathering to celebrate their renewed connection. The letter from George, now framed and displayed prominently on the mantel, had become a symbol of everything they had rediscovered. Its presence lent the room a sacred air, a reminder of love's enduring strength. As Margaret crossed the room, she spotted Henry by the fireplace, his usual sharp wit softened by the glow of the flames. He looked up as she approached, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're beaming, Margaret," he said, his voice teasing but kind. "What's the occasion?" Margaret chuckled, settling into the chair beside him. "My family will be here soon. All of them. It's been years since we've been in the same room for something like this." Henry nodded, his expression growing thoughtful. "You've worked hard for this, you know. It's not easy bringing people together, especially family." Margaret smiled, her gaze drifting to the framed letter. "I had a little help." The evening unfolded like a cherished memory in the making. Peter arrived first, carrying a platter of his homemade pastries, his face lit with the quiet pride of someone finding his way. Anna followed shortly after, her children in tow, their laughter filling the room as they dashed to the table laden with treats. David brought his usual charm, his quick wit sparking laughter among the residents as he greeted them warmly. Margaret watched it all unfold, her heart full as she moved among them, ensuring everyone felt welcome. The room had never felt more alive, the conversations flowing freely, the bonds between her family and the care home's residents strengthening with every passing moment. As the evening wore on, Ella gathered everyone near the fireplace for a small ceremony of sorts. She spoke warmly of Margaret's contributions to the care home, her voice filled with admiration. "Margaret has brought us together in ways we couldn't have imagined," Ella said, her gaze sweeping the room. "And tonight, we celebrate not just her, but the love and connection she shared with all of us." The applause that followed brought a flush to Margaret's cheeks, but her heart swelled with gratitude. She stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly as she addressed the room. "This place has given me more than I ever expected," she began, her eyes meeting those of the people she had come to call family. "When I first came here, I was searching for purpose, for connection. What I found was so much more. Each of you has touched my life in ways I can't put into words." She turned to her children, her voice softening. "And you, Peter, Anna, David, you've reminded me of the strength of family, even when it feels like it's slipping away. I'm so proud of each of you, and I'm so grateful we're here together." Her words hung in the air, a quiet testament to the journey they had all taken. As she sat down, Anna leaned over, her hand squeezing Margaret's tightly. "You've given us so much, Mom," Anna said, her voice trembling, "more than we ever realized." Peter nodded, his expression serious, "And it's time we started giving back." The evening ended with a simple yet powerful moment. Margaret, her children, and the residents joined hands in a circle, singing a familiar Christmas carol as the fire crackled softly in the hearth. The warmth of their voices filled the room, each note carrying a sense of belonging and hope. Margaret closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. In that moment, she felt whole. The years of longing, of quiet heartache, had given way to something stronger, a love that endured, that healed, that bound them together no matter the distance or time. As the song ended, laughter and applause erupted, the room brimming with joy. Margaret looked around, her gaze lingering on the faces of her children, the friends she had made, and the life she had rebuilt. She knew that this was not an ending, but a beginning. A promise of the future they would create together. Later, as the care home quieted and her children said their goodbyes, Margaret lingered by the fire with Henry. The letter from George remained on the mantel, a silent witness to the evening's events. "You did it, Margaret," Henry said, his voice gentle. "You brought them back together." Margaret smiled, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "No, Henry. We did it, together." As the fire crackled softly and the snow fell lightly outside, Margaret felt a peace she had never known. It was a peace born of love, tested, enduring, and infinite. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.